I went to the Daily Journal meeting, this company that Charlie was chairman of for many years. And as luck would have it, I was actually sitting next to his daughter there, and I started chatting to his daughter. And so I took the opportunity to interview her. And I think I quote her briefly in the book. And there was one part where she said he wanted to have money because he wanted to have independence. Money was important to him as a marker of success and a way to be independent and to live the way he wanted to live. But she said something like, it was never going to be at the cost of his life. It was never going to be, he wouldn't sacrifice his life or his honor or his integrity for the money. And so what I ended up concluding about Charlie, in part, was that it was the manner of the victory that mattered. It wasn't going to just be about maximizing his own wealth, but losing his soul in some sense. And I think there's something kind of beautiful and instructive about that.
Hello and welcome everyone. I am Vishal Khandelwal and this is the 1% Show. This show is an open-ended exploration into the minds of the wisest people around to help us learn to think, invest and live each day as little as 1% better. You can learn more at vishalkhandelwal.com. My guest today is William Green, the author of Richer, Wiser, Happier: How the World's Greatest Investors Win in Markets and Life. Over the last 25 years or more, William has interviewed many of the world's best investors, exploring in depth the question of what qualities and insights enable them to achieve enduring success. He has written extensively about investing for many publications and has been interviewed about the greatest investors for magazines, newspapers, podcasts, radio, and television. He has also given many talks about the lessons we can learn from the most successful investors, not only about how to invest, but also about how to improve our thinking and improve our lives. Born and raised in London, William was educated at Eton College, studied English literature at Oxford University, and received a master's degree from Columbia University's Graduate School of Journalism. With this introduction and no further delay, William, welcome to the 1% Show, and thank you so much for taking out time from your busy schedule to agree to do this.
Thanks so much, Vishal. I'm delighted to be here with you.
Great, William. So, William, I want to start this conversation with the end. And that's the end of your book, where you quote Charlie Munger, who said that if all you succeed in doing in life is getting rich by buying little pieces of paper, it's a failed life. Life is more than being shrewd in wealth accumulation. So how would you like to explain what Charlie meant when he said this?
Yeah, in a way, it was a slightly subversive thing to me to write at the end of a book about investing, or at least purportedly about investing, because on the surface, what the book is about is saying, yeah, here are these ways to get rich. Here are these ways to win this particular game. But underneath, what I'm trying to say is, yeah, but why do you even want to get rich? What actually does being rich mean? And what constitutes a rich and truly abundant life? And so, particularly at the end of the book, in the epilogue, I'm trying to pull back and say, yeah, it's all very well trying to get rich, but what happens if you actually miss the real game, which is to have a truly abundant life? And I think that's what Charlie is referring to. And one of the things that struck me, I went to the Daily Journal meeting, this company that Charlie was chairman of for many years. And as luck would have it, I was actually sitting next to his daughter there, and I started chatting to his daughter. And so I took the opportunity to interview her. And I think I quote her briefly in the book. And there was one part where she said he was never... He wanted to have money because he wanted to have independence. Money was important to him as a marker of success and a way to be independent and to live the way he wanted to live. But she said something like it was never going to be at the cost of his life. It was never going to be, he wouldn't sacrifice his life or his honor or his integrity for the money. And so what I ended up concluding about Charlie, in part, was that it was the manner of the victory that mattered. It wasn't going to just be about maximizing his own wealth, but losing his soul in some sense. And I think I think there's something kind of beautiful and instructive about that.
That's so true. That's so true. So I'm going to ask you a lot of questions about Charlie Munger, your meeting with Charlie Munger and DJCO, right? And also about money and happiness, I think, which you mentioned about in your book.
Yeah, and I see
Before that,
you have the Charlie Munger book right behind you next to the pictures of your family. So I can see he's had a big impact on you as well, Vishal. He had a
that
big
side over,
impact on me.
you please continue.
Yeah, no, he had a big impact on me as well. I think when you see Charlie, I tell you another thing that really surprised me about Charlie. Um, when I interviewed him, and when also I attended that daily journal meeting and saw him interacting with the disciples who'd come from around the world to see him, what surprised me is Charlie has this reputation for being very brusque and somewhat rude, and not for for not suffering fools gladly, right? I remember, for example, Bill Miller once saying to me that he ran into Charlie in Midtown Manhattan, and he said, "Charlie," and Charlie turns around and says, "Who the hell are you?" And then when he introduces himself and says, "Well, we met once at Harvard at an event on behavioral finance," Charlie was incredibly nice and goes and walks around with him in Manhattan for the next hour. But so he has this tough exterior that he's known as this sort of tough, slightly rude, slightly curt guy. And what struck me actually was the kindness of this old man. When I met him, he must have been 96, I think. And I was very struck by the fact that he stayed after the daily journal meeting and continued to answer something like another 2 hours of questions. So you have all of these disciples hanging around the table, and he's eating See's candy, and it's just flying everywhere. It was sort of, falling all over his jacket and crumbling on the table there, and he's handing around the See's candy to the people who are around there asking him questions. And it was almost, I'm Jewish, so I don't know much about Christianity, but it was like sacrament. It was like the it was like one of those holy wafers. The See's candy was such an important company for Berkshire Hathaway, and here's this old sage eating See's candy and sharing it with his disciples. And I didn't really say this in the book because I think it would have sounded too sentimental. But what I was really trying to convey was that I felt like what he was showing for these disciples was really love. It was these he kept wanting to share more ideas and more wisdom with them. And he would sort of say something like, you'll be okay in life if you do this, and if you do this, it'll be fun. And so there was something incredibly generous spirited about that. And I've thought about that a lot in recent months, the degree to which Charlie, Warren Buffett, Monish Pabrai, Guy Spier, all these people I see in this kind of circle around Warren and Charlie, they're working on themselves, and they're improving. And I find it kind of inspiring, the fact that Charlie has worked on himself and improved. And maybe he was always kind of there was always a gentler interior. I suspect there always was. But I also think he's that side of him, the mentor, the friend, the advisor, the sage. That's maybe become more pronounced over the years. Less just the witty, funny curmudgeon.
That's true. So I was at the DJCU meeting in 2018, right? It was, I think, for the first time held in a hotel, and there were, I think, 300, 400 people in the room. Uh, uh, I realized that I'm not really sure whether I would be able to see Charlie in person again in life, right? So whether I would be able to travel to the US to attend any of the meeting. I've never been to Berkshire. So I went to DJCU, especially because it was a small meeting, small size meeting, right? And you could get a much more direct access to Charlie Munger, right? Much more closer. You can sit much more closer. And I experienced the reassurance that you're talking about, right? That the wisdom that he shines through, right? So I got to ask him a question. And the first statement that he made actually was so reassuring that I actually forgot everything that he answered after that. Right. So it was such a wonderful experience for me. So I completely agree with what you mentioned about Charlie, the kind of impact he's had on so many lives.
What did you ask him? What did you want to know?
Yeah, so I asked him basically that given that I have been a teacher of investing, value investing, and decision making, right, and good behavior, right. So I asked him for his advice on what other things could I do to help my students, help my kids become better human beings, right.
Hmm,
And his answer, like typical Charlie, he said that if you know what you're doing, you're already halfway through, right. So since you're asking this question, you're already halfway through, right, and you're all doing things right, and that was so reassuring for me, right. So that was
that's
great.
great. I think I mean it's a very interesting question, and I think about this a lot, and I talked about it a bit with Monish as well about parenting, among other things, recently when I had him on my podcast. And what he was saying is it's really about what you do, not what you say, because your kids in particular, they notice your behavior. So I often talk to my kids about trying to be kinder and more compassionate and the like, and then they see me losing my temper when I'm hungry or tired or stressed or something, and because they're really bright. My kids are 24. I have a 24-year-old son Henry and a 21-year-old daughter Madeline, and they can see when you're not living up to what you say. And so one of the things I try to do in life, I'm kind of trying to close the gap between what I say and what I am. And there's at times the gap is so enormous that it's kind of shameful, and you just feel terrible about it and you get kind of despairing. But I'm not sure that despair and shame are very helpful. I think it's probably better to be kind of hopeful and to be like, no, I can improve. And there's a beautiful line that I often quote to my kids, and I often think about myself from a great meditation teacher called Sharon Salzberg, who would talk about when you're trying to focus on the breath as you're meditating, and then you lose the breath, and then you have to notice that you've got lost, and you come back to it. And she said, let go and begin again with self-compassion. And I think that's such a beautiful idea for life, not just for meditation, but for life. And so every time you're tripping up, every time you're messing up, you're saying, okay, yeah, I'm an idiot. Yeah, I was a fool. Yeah, I was unethical, or I lied to myself or someone else, or this gap between who I am and what I try to be, or what I pretend to be, or what I say is embarrassingly large. But let go with self-compassion and begin again. But I do think that aspect of modeling behavior, so is so important. So it's not just what Warren and Charlie say, although they're immensely articulate and eloquent. It's what they actually do. That's what's powerful. So when you see Charlie being kind to those disciples, you think, that's interesting. This tough, brusque, rude guy who naturally is impatient with fools and ignorant people and people who are investing stupidly and the like, has changed and is taking the time and the care to be kind to these people. And so then you think, okay, well, so there's hope for me. I can become kinder and more compassionate as well and focus more on other people. And so I'm not saying this kind of in a glib, facile way. I really take a lot of heart from the fact that I can see Charlie and Warren improving. And Warren talked about it very explicitly at the Berkshire Hathaway annual meeting, where he said something about how if things have gone well for you and you've had a modicum of success, you really need to be a better person in the second half of your life than in the first half. And that really struck me. It made me think, is Warren saying, I screwed up. I wasn't as good a person as I should have been in the first half of my life. So maybe, so obviously he was very ethical in terms of his business. He made brilliant decisions. He had a very fair financial structure, like a fee structure, both for his limited partnerships in the 50s and then for Berkshire itself. So there were obviously ways in which he was absolutely extraordinary. And he obviously attracted an incredible circle of friends, like very ethical managers for his companies and employees and the like. So he was obviously doing a lot right. But I wondered if what he was saying is, well, maybe I should have spent more time with my kids. Maybe I should have been a better husband, or whatever it was. And so that in a way, that was almost the biggest lesson from the Berkshire meeting that I got, was here's Buffett saying, I'm trying to be a better person in the second half of my life. And I see some of the ways in which he behaves towards friends of mine, where I would see, for example, him writing a letter to Guy Spier saying, your annual report was great, and your partners must be really happy. Or he would write to Monish and say, what you've achieved with Dakshana is so extraordinary, and even the fact that I'm mentioned in your annual report, I'm honored to be mentioned. And just it's kind of it's an old guy worth over $100 billion taking the time to write a letter to two letters to two guys in their 50s to encourage their good behavior. And so think of how little effort it takes him, and yet how enormously encouraging and heartening it is for them. And so he's using his social capital, his moral capital, his time to lift up other people. And so when I see that, that makes me think, oh, that's really interesting. That's Warren understanding the power of kindness and compassion and encouragement. And it points the way towards how we want to behave as we get older, and how we want to become better as well. Maybe you're further ahead than I am, Vishal, but I look at that and I think, okay, so when Warren is saying, I mean, he said very explicitly in that Berkshire meeting, he said, maybe you have this revelation at some point in your life where the illusion disappears and you suddenly realize something that you'd never seen very clearly. So you realize, for example, how important it is to be loved, and that the way to be loved is to become more lovable. And he said it in a way that was so easy to miss. He said it in passing, so that I think he wasn't trying to be sanctimonious or to say, look how lovable I am and how loved I am. But I think he didn't want to be self-congratulatory. This is my amateur psychoanalysis. Who knows whether it's true at all. But I think he was saying, look, you realize as you grow older how important it is to be kinder and to be more loved and to be more lovable. And so he was trying to share this advice without trying to sound too pious. And when someone that wise and that smart is planting these clues for you with their words, but also with their behavior, that in a way, I think, is what you want to clone. And I saw the same thing with Guy at that meeting. I've mentioned this once before. I think I mentioned it to Guy himself, but I don't think I've mentioned it publicly yet. That there was a moment on the night of the Berkshire annual meeting in Omaha where I'd been having a drink with Guy and with Li Lu, and it was very late. It was maybe 1 a.m. or something like that. And these people came up and really wanted to take a photo and say hi to Li Lu and to Guy, and to be, I think it was exciting. It was like, it was like me seeing, Keith Richards and Mick Jagger or whatever it was, and and it wasn't really an appropriate moment because we were so deep in conversation, and Li Lu was on a roll, and and he's a fascinating character, right? I mean, he's a billionaire who manages a portion of Charlie's fortune, and he's brilliant. And so these guys went away, and they were sort of having a chat elsewhere in the lobby of this hotel. And later, after Li Lu left, it's probably 1:15 a.m. or something, and Guy says to me, we should go say hello to those people. I need to go say hello to them. And he just didn't want to leave them feeling in some way dissed or insulted or neglected. And so maybe 1:15 a.m, we go over and chat to these people, and we take some photos with them, and I think they were really happy, and they felt like they'd been seen and recognized. And I see that, and I've been friends with Guy for 25 years, and in a weird way, I was kind of proud of him when we left. I was like, oh, Guy's getting better too. I mean, he was always a very sweet person. He was always a very nice person. But where I see that behavior, that's so powerful compared to just the words. When you actually see Guy's desire at 1:15 in the morning to be kind to these strangers, and this is when he'd got up at 5 something in the morning to go line up to be first in line at the annual meeting. So I knew how tired he was and how much he'd done that day, and yet before he goes to bed, he's taking the time to make these people feel included. So it's the modeling of behavior, I think, rather than the words, that's so powerful. This is an incredibly long-winded answer, Vishal, to a question that you didn't have.
I think that's the best thing about talking to you, William, right? So I expect to receive much more wisdom, right, than I thought I would, or I think I would. I think so.
We live in hope.
No, I think
I'll
this
do my
hope will be
best.
fulfilled. Great. Uh, uh, I had this question about compounding goodwill that you and Guy have talked about, right? And you have written on your book. One of the most important things which I take from your book is about the idea of the Mensch Effect, right? That you've mentioned, right? So basically, for the audience, a Mensch is someone someone whom we should admire and emulate, someone who's of noble character. And as per your book, Mensch Effect is the idea of being consistently kind and decent in dealing with others, like you talked about Buffett and Munger and Guy Spier, right? And you also. Your idea of a mensch takes me to Guy Spier's idea of compounding goodwill that involves treating people incredibly kindly, which seems like a huge advantage over others who are unkind, right? Or who may be too busy to even pause and reflect whether they have been rude or unkind to others in their own journey. So I wonder if you could just talk about that idea of compounding goodwill. I have heard Guy Spier's version, right? But I want to
Yeah.
hear your version of the Mensch effect or the compounding goodwill idea, which I think is such a profound idea.
Yeah, thanks for asking that. So Mensch, you gave a very good definition. It's a Yiddish word, I think. And so being Jewish, it's something that, growing up, we would just say, oh, he's such a Mensch. You'd see someone, you know it when you see it, right? Where you see someone taking care of someone in a way that's just really decent. So when I see Guy behaving that way towards those strangers at 1:15 in the morning, I'm like, here's a Mensch. That's very nice. So yeah, I was very proud of myself for coining that term, the Mensch effect. I was overly proud of myself, but part of it came from seeing Guy operate and the way Guy very consciously is out there compounding goodwill by being kind to people. And in the early days that Guy was doing this, there was definitely a lot of self-interest involved in it. He's wonderfully candid about these things. And he talks about the fact that he understood Robert Cialdini's idea of reciprocation, and that if you behave decently to people, they want to reciprocate. And so he thought, well, so if I keep writing thank you letters to people and keep being kind to people, they'll wish me well and will help me, and it's going to help me professionally. So as a young, ambitious guy from Oxford and Harvard Business School, wanting to become rich and successful and have the world love him, this idea really appealed to him. But there was a great unexpected comic effect of this, which is that he then gets totally addicted to the feelings of happiness that he gets from helping other people. And so it may have started cynical, but it becomes less and less cynical because he actually starts to become very joyful the more he helps other people. And so this taps into a really powerful principle in life, right? Because if you study things like behavioral finance or behavioral psychology, which I'm at best a very, very amateur commentator on, you come across phrases like the hedonic treadmill, which is a beautiful phrase, right? Where the more of a hedonist that you are, the more you chase after your own pleasure, the more you get stuck on this treadmill where you're never really advancing. And I think we're all aware of it, right? You go eat a fantastic meal and it's just such a delight. And then you go back to the same restaurant 3 or 4 more times. And you're like, yeah, it's good, but I don't know. Like the second time I had that dish, it just wasn't as pleasing. And you find the same with many of the other things in life that give us a quick hit of energy, but don't ultimately please us. There's sort of diminishing return. And so I think one of the great paradoxes of life is that the more people start to focus on helping others and being less selfish, the happier they become. And Jim O'Shaughnessy, who has a very nice podcast called Infinite Loops, is a very wise and thoughtful guy who wrote a book called I think What Works on Wall Street. I was listening to a conversation that he had recently, and he was saying something like one of the great ironies in life is that you don't achieve happiness by aiming for happiness. It's a side effect. It's a consequence of other stuff. And so there's something really, really powerful and profound about that idea that by compounding goodwill and focusing on lifting others up, you're somehow becoming happier yourself, even though you're not focusing on yourself. And I suspect we sense that with our children, right? That's the first thing where I remember once being with my kids in Hong Kong, because they grew up in Hong Kong for a few years. So I was working for Time Magazine, and my son Henry, when he was very young, he used to swell up enormously when he got a mosquito bite, and I always got bitten hell wherever I was, and I remember being in this room and seeing a mosquito and thinking, I hope it bites me, not Henry. And I remember thinking, God, am I actually becoming more altruistic? Like a little less selfish? It was one of those things where, like, for one of the first times in my life, I was like, God, my love for my son actually trumps my own selfishness and desire not to be bitten. And so I think we sense that with our kids, that the more we care about someone else, the better life is. But hopefully that gradually expands and it applies to other people too. So I think that's something that Guy tapped into. I see it very powerfully with someone like Tom Gayner, who I also write about in that chapter. But Tom also is just a mensch, and he said to me at one point something that was very very candid in a way that most people wouldn't be, because it would sound self-congratulatory, where he said, I'm a nice guy, and that's one of my competitive advantages. Because he said, there are so many people who are out there who want to help me. And he said, and it just helps. It just helps. He repeated it. And I had an extraordinary experience with Tom recently where I'd become a senior advisor to a big investment firm here in New York. And they asked me if I could find someone to interview, one of the famous investors to interview at this private event that they had. And there were only going to be maybe 35 people there. And there was, in many ways, nothing in it at all for a famous money manager to come and sit there for an hour and have me ask them questions privately for another investment firm's private event for their staff. And so I thought, God, who am I going to ask? I don't want to let down these people by not getting someone. And the very first thing I did, I wrote to Tom Gayner and I said, would you do this? We could do it either on Zoom because of COVID, or we could do it in person. And he writes back and he says, no, let's do it in person. There's much better energy in person. And so he comes to this event, and we had dinner the night before with our hosts at this investment firm. And then the next morning I interview him for an hour, and then he goes home. And it turns out, when I asked him about this, he took a train for 6 hours from Virginia to this meeting for me to interview him, and then 6 hours home the next day. And so here's a guy who's the co-CEO of a Fortune 400 company with something like, I don't know, at last count, I think when I checked, it had about 17,000 employees and about 20 private companies that he manages. And he was managing over $20 billion in assets last time I checked. And he takes the time to travel for 6 hours, stay in a hotel that night, all at his own expense, and just to be kind, just to be helpful. And that's a guy who's actually wise. He's kind of prematurely wise. He hasn't waited till he's in his 90s like Warren and Charlie to be a sage. Like there's something about Tom that's kind of, he's been very early to figure out these lessons. And I have a feeling it comes partly because partly it's his own wiring, but partly I think it's he had a very extraordinary father who he was extremely inspired by. And when you see someone tap into these principles for how to behave in life, you watch it in action, it has an effect on you. It's the modeling of behavior rather than what he says. So if Tom says to you, "Yeah, I'm a nice guy," you're like, yeah. But then when you actually see someone put themselves out to help you for no reward, you think, that's why he's loved. And let me try to become a little bit more like that, despite my selfishness, despite my stress, despite my fear, despite my all of my flaws and all of my natural wiring that make me want to be selfish and want to look out for myself. Let me at least push in that direction because I can see that it works. So that's been very inspiring to me, and it's also instructive because it makes you think, how can I model that behavior more myself? But even being aware that it's desirable behavior and that it works is very helpful, because I think part of the problem, Vishal, is that we get so much disinformation as we grow up, whether it's when you're at school as a kid and there's this kind of dog eat dog sense of competition. I don't know about you, but I went to these kind of posh private schools where there was a sense of, for me to win, someone else had to lose. I literally, when I was a boy, from the age of 13 to 17, I think I was at Eton, where Boris Johnson and David Cameron, and Prince William, Prince Harry, all of these people were. And they don't do this anymore, but they would literally put you in a room with 200, 220 kids in your class and read from 220 to number one out loud where you came in your class. And so think of how disastrous that is for some people. So I remember exactly where certain people came in the class. So it's a total out of scorecard way of living. And so you grow up with this sense of, it's a mean, rough, hard-edged world, and I'm competing with everyone else, and I got to show them that I'm the smartest, I'm the best, or I'm not as stupid as they think I am. And so it sets up the world as a kind of hostile place, and that's out to get you in some way. And then you see TV shows like Billions and Succession, where you see people behaving in a rapacious, selfish way and getting ahead. And then you also go into the workplace and you see some people behave like snakes and get ahead. And you start to say there's no justice. And you can think, well, so maybe I should just be a nihilist, and maybe I should just behave badly myself and just be out for myself. And so it's very easy to kind of tap into this whole other system where you start to think, yeah, that's smart behavior. It's a Darwinian jungle out there, and I have to be lord of the jungle. And part of the difficulty is that it actually works in many cases. Like, you can see people in the investment business who get ahead and become multi-billionaires, leave a trail of destruction, a trail of lawsuits, a trail of divorces, but they become these kind of mighty famous figures. But I think you have to recognize what the downside is. And there's a beautiful line from Ed Thorpe, I think towards the end of my book, where he talks about people who spend their whole life chasing wealth and fame and fortune, and then at the end they discover that they had nothing, that it was just a wasted life, that they chased the wrong thing. And so I think it's very helpful to recognize that there's this other system that people like Charlie and Warren embody, and Monish and Guy and Tom Gayner, Arnold Vandenberg. And I'm not trying to lionize these people and say that they're perfect, because, like us, they have their flaws and foibles. I'm sure they're messing up and doing things they're not proud of all of the time, or at least pretty regularly. So you don't want to worship anyone, because then also you get down on yourself and you think, well, I'm such a schmuck, and how come these people are all so wonderful and I'm not? But it points you to this whole other system that works. And I love that line from Munger where he says, I observe what works and doesn't work and why. And so I think if I have some sort of subtle proselytizing mission, it's to hold up this good behavior of people like this and say, look, it works. And so not only is it more enlightened and better behavior, but it actually makes them happier. And instead of leaving a trail of destruction, they leave a trail of goodwill. And that's an incredibly powerful lesson. And that actually has changed my life. And I think it was very hard for me when I first started to see Guy operating this way. It was probably when we were working on the Educational Value Investor together, where I helped him write his memoir, and I was kind of living with him in Zurich some of the time, and we were working very closely together. And I was going through a really hard period in my life where I'd been laid off by Time magazine as the editor of the European, Middle East, and African editions, and I felt kind of very bruised. And sort of worried, and we'd gone through the financial crisis. And I would look at Guy being kind of magnanimous and generous and kind, and I would think, yeah, well, it's all very well for you behaving this way. You're like on top of the world. You're, rich, well-known, successful. And it was harder for me to buy into that idea. And it reminds me of that beautiful line that Buffett and Munger often quote from Ben Franklin, where they said, an empty sack can't stand straight. And so when you feel empty, when you feel like the world is out to get you and you failed and everyone else has money and everyone else is succeeding and you're kind of lagging, it's a tremendous leap of faith, I think, to say, yeah, even though I feel this way, I still want to try to be a better person. And I remember a friend of mine saying to me that between these two stools, these two systems, there's a kind of period of disappearance where you kind of lose yourself and you're like, well, wait, my old system of just trying to get ahead by being as sharp-elbowed and determined and driven as I can be, I've seen that is kind of bogus, and I've dismantled that. But it drove me for all those years. I was so driven by fear and a desire to impress everyone and a desire to get ahead and all these somewhat negative emotions that are very powerful if you harness them. And then there's this new model where you're like, let me be kinder, let me help other people, let me compound goodwill. And you're like, yeah, but what if I dismantle the old system that kind of worked? And there is this terrifying period, I think, where there's this disappearance between the two systems and you're a little lost for a while. And then you, hopefully, I'm not saying this in a self-righteous way because I still have a lot of those flaws. But I think when you embrace that new system more fully, it starts to be very miraculous. And you start to think, God, this actually works. And you suddenly start to have all these people around you who are helping you because you're trying to be a nicer, more decent person. And it's kind of miraculous. And you look around and the quality of the people in your life are better and better. But so I think it takes a leap of faith in a way to embrace this different model. Maybe it's easier for other people because, like Tom Gayner, they had a wonderful father or something, or their wiring was just good. I see it with my wife and my daughter. They're just nicer people than I am. It's easier for them. I don't think it was ever an option for them to follow the other system. But for the rest of us who are more flawed, seeing the model of people behaving this way and it working is tremendously inspiring. And then if you start to behave a little better and you start to see the impact, you want to kind of build evidence, this kind of packet of evidence where you're like, oh, so when I did that, it worked. When I did this, it worked. When I did that, it worked. Let me just think, maybe there's a pattern here. And maybe there's a reason why people like Buffett and Munger are behaving this way, or Guy is behaving this way. And That's been one of the most important lessons I think I've learned from studying the great investors. It's not ultimately about getting rich. It's about having a richer life. And if you're behaving in that way, I think you have more self-respect. You're surrounded by people who wish you well. So the world seems like a more benevolent place.
Completely agree with you. The role that probably parents play in, like you mentioned the story of Tom's father, right? And
Mhm.
the kind of upbringing he's had, and also I'm sure the same kind of upbringing and the lessons that even Warren Buffett, Charlie Munger got from their early childhood, right?
Yeah. And Tom actually said to me his father was the richest man he ever met. And he said that's a psychological statement because he said, "Look, I've hung out with Buffett and Munger and all of these guys. He Tom Gayner was on the board of the Washington Post with Buffett, so he was working very closely with Buffett, and he goes for dinner every year with Munger. So for him to say my father was the richest man I ever met, and so his father was a kind of small town um, lawyer, if I remember, accountant, living on a maybe 80, 100 acre farm, um, and doing very small property deals. But one of the things that Tom said to me is he had enough. He always felt like he had enough. He didn't need a fancy car. Um, and I see the same with Tom. Um, Tom obviously has made a fortune as co-CEO of Markel, where he's been for, over 30 years, if I remember correctly. And I went to have dinner in his house, and he has this very modest townhouse. I mean, it's nice, it's very nice, but it's not grand, it's not flashy. It's a nice suburban townhouse, and one of the reasons he likes it is that it's no trouble. He doesn't have to mow the lawn or anything. And he has this enormous bookcase in the middle of his living room that goes sort of from floor to ceiling. And kind of wall to wall. I mean, it's an enormous bookshelf, so it's a good place for him to think, to hang out. And when I went for dinner with him, he literally, we spent the day in his office with me interviewing him, and then we go back for dinner, and we stop at the supermarket, and he's driving his little crappy Prius car, which, this is, it's not even like he's driving a fancy Tesla electric car. He's driving his little Prius hybrid car, and he stops there and he's walking around the supermarket with a, the basket, getting salmon and ice cream and stuff, so that he can cook this journalist dinner that I can have with him and his wife. And I'm thinking as we get into the car, and and he's he's putting his bag of groceries in the car. How many Fortune 400 CEOs would do this? That's an extraordinary thing. There's an extraordinary kind of humility to that, and that lives with you. That really lives with you. When you see someone like that, they can someone can tell you, well, it's not about the money. It's not about becoming super rich. And you're like, yeah, 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 yeah. But when you see the guy actually living that way, and then taking pleasure out of cooking this really nice dinner, and then uh, at the start of the meal, you sit there, and he and his wife literally they hold your hands and say grace. And I remember him saying, um, when he was saying grace, he said something like, "Thank you for the friendship, and I hope this friendship continues to build," or something like that. And so it's not in a. I mean, I would have been kind of embarrassed to say that, right? Because it sounds. I mean, an Englishman could never say something like that, right? It's like an English man of my age. Like, we're so repressed; it's very difficult to be so open. But it was kind of lovely. Like, there's something. So Tom has figured out that living in this humble way, not super humble. I mean, as he would say, it's not like a Mother Teresa, right? I mean, he he lives well, but it's striking. He didn't take a private plane to New York to come to that meeting. He took a train, and he said, "Look, it was wonderful for me. It's like a spa. I was sitting on that train reading for 6 hours. What an amazing thing!" And so I don't know. You see the action, you see the behavior, and it inspires you. And it's striking to me that Tom learned it from his father, I think, and that's so it gives you a head start if you have parents or family or a role model that you can look at that show you good ways to behave that work. But I think for many people, you want to pick the right role models, right? You want to in the same way that Charlie says you want to hang out with the eminent dead. So he's hanging out with Ben Franklin and Darwin and all of these great thinkers and moral exemplars that he admires. So you choose your own circle of influence, and you do it with with your friends, with the people whose books you read, um, even with the companies you invest in. You think about who am I hanging out with? Who the CEO of this company? Do they behave honorably? Are they transparent? So structuring your ecosystem so it's full of people like that who tilt the tilt the odds of you behaving well. um that's very powerful. So it's not we all have both of these sides in us, right? I mean, we're all capable of behaving absolutely terribly, particularly under stress, I think, or when things aren't going well. um when the bag feels empty, the sack feels empty and can't stand straight. And so I think one way of stacking the odds in your favor is as Warren said to Monish and Guy at their charity lunch in 2008. He said, "Hang out with people who are better than you, and you can't help but improve." That's a very powerful idea. Like they say these things that sound so simple, but if you actually think about it, if you take it seriously, it changes your attitude to everything. You're like, oh, okay, so I want more people um like Tom Gayner in my life, uh and fewer snakes. And maybe I remember Guy saying to me once that Monish used to say to him, "Why the hell do you still own Berkshire Hathaway? There are better ways for you to invest your money. You could do it in a more dynamic way." And Guy has just held on to Berkshire for over 20 years. And Guy said, this is years ago, he was saying to me that he likes having Berkshire in his portfolio. Like, it's good to have Warren and Charlie in his life and in his mind. It creates a kind of ballast and anchor, something that steadies him. And I feel the same way. I own Berkshire, and I'm sure there are racier things that will do better. And but you're not even paying. You're not. They make $100,000 each in salary. I mean, it's to run this enormous company. And someone said to me, maybe it was Monish said to me recently, I can't remember. I think he said Charlie didn't want any salary at all. He would prefer to have had nothing. But then I think one of them was like, no, the world won't take you seriously if you don't charge anything at all, or something like that. I'm probably garbling this, but so you see these guys who they're not making money off you, they're making money with you. And so you want that in your portfolio, you want it in your book collection, you want it among your friends. You want to create this environment that makes it more likely that you're going to behave well, I think.
That's right. I completely agree. And thank you for sharing all those insights, William. I think I'm completely enamored by where this discussion is going. Right, the kind of insights you've shared about all these people you've come in contact with over the years, and you've been kind enough to put that all in the book. And I'm getting probably much more than what you've mentioned
Ha,
in the book.
thanks.
Uh, just going by the title of your book, which is Richer, Wiser, and Happier. Right. If I remove the wiser from your title, right? Can just getting richer make people happier? That's my question, right? In other words, in your experience of being in the company of some of the richest investors in the world, how do you connect this equation of money being able to buy happiness that so many of us strive in our life, throughout our life, right? We chase happiness by way of money, right? You have written in the book about pondering this question of what makes a person rich, right? What answer did you find?
I didn't want to be naive about it and say money doesn't matter at all. It's all just love and roses and rainbows. I Because I've been through times where I was really worried about money, and it's no fun. And I went through this period in late 2008 where I got laid off from my job in the middle of the financial crisis, and um, I had two kids in private school in England and very expensive rent in London, which is one of the world's most expensive cities. And I'd been paid for by Time Magazine. They paid for my rent, they paid for my kids' private schooling and stuff. And suddenly, I'm in this unbelievably expensive city without that incredible luxury. And my stock portfolio kind of plummets at the same time during the financial crisis. And it was really scary. And luckily, everything worked out well. And thank God I didn't have to sell any shares at the bottom. I actually was able to buy, and I found another good job. And I didn't have any debt because I was kind of a pessimist, and I've been a journalist for many years, and you always knew that things were going to go wrong um, because you'd already survived, 5 rounds of layoffs or whatever. But that corrosive fear of not being able to take care of your kids or your wife or your family, not be that I wanted to honor that reality and admit that you need to be able to pay your bills. You don't want the fear of not being able to pay your bills. And so I think having financial security and financial independence is immensely valuable. I don't need to be vastly rich. I just don't. It's not what I value. Um, I care much more about having the freedom to live the way I want to live. I want to be in charge of my time and be free to read and think and see people I like and work on the projects that I want to work on without having to work with people who I think are dishonest or dishonorable or bullies or doing something unsalubrious that I'd rather avoid. And when you're really strapped for cash, an empty sack can't stand straight. It's really hard actually to turn down projects with people you dislike, or to operate with very high integrity, or to walk away from a situation where you can see what the ethical choice is, but there's this tremendous temptation to avert your eyes and line your own pockets. And so I think one of the things that I see again and again with the very wealthy, very financially wealthy people that I've interviewed is that the thing they treasure most is the independence. And this is something that Charlie has said very explicitly. He said he never wanted to be subordinate to somebody. He wanted to be he wanted that sense of freedom. And so the money was important to him for that reason. Bill Ackman, multi-billionaire here in New York, said the same thing to me once. He said, I wanted the freedom to say what I think, to do what I think, to live the way I think, to live the way I want. There was a kind of there's a kind of abrasiveness to Bill. Like he's a tough, kind of swaggering, confident guy, and he wanted to be free to operate the way he wanted to operate. I see the same thing with Monish, that Monish has structured his life in a way that's profoundly true to who he is. So he rolls up in the office when he wants, wearing the clothes that he wants. When I visited him at his office in Irvine, it looked like he was about to go for a stroll on the beach. So he's sitting there in a very nice office, surrounded by all his books and his art and his pictures of Charlie and Warren and the like, and memorabilia. And he's just structured things in a way that he likes. So, for example, he would say, I don't like all of the mumbo jumbo of marketing my fund. And so if people wanted to invest in his fund and wanted to have a meeting with him uh, every few months to discuss their investment, he's like, not interested. He's like, I'm just going to turn away that money. He's like, they can come to the annual meeting where I'll talk to all of the shareholders equally. And the fact that they have a ton of money does not entitle them to more of my time because I'm not interested in the mumbo jumbo of marketing the fund. That's an amazing thing to have the freedom to turn away fees because you can't be bothered to have meetings with prospective clients or current clients, however much money they have. That's a really precious thing. And so there's something very antisocial about that, right? It's very easy to say, well, that's kind of arrogant of him, and he should, if they've entrusted him with lots of money, he should meet with them, and it's no big deal for him. But I think what's interesting to me is the way that Monish has structured his life to be true to him, and so this had a huge effect on me, seeing people like Monish, Nick Sleep, Guy structuring their lives in ways that were true to them. Because I started to think, okay, so how much money do I actually need in order to do that? And so it's different for all of us, but I don't need a fancy car. I mean, I'm driving a crappy old Honda CRV. I mean, it's like 8-9 years old that I've literally never taken to get cleaned. I mean, I think my wife and kids once every 6 months or something are sufficiently disgusted that they'll take it to get washed or something. But I just don't care about that. And I took it to get repaired last week. I mean, it's in good condition because I don't drive very much. But I took it to get repaired the other day, and they were like, "Yeah, this could last you another 10 years." And I'm like, God, really? Do I want this kind of ugly, mediocre car for another 10 years, or should I be getting like an Audi or a BMW or something a little nicer? And they're like, nah, it's fine. It's fine. Whereas for me to buy a limitless number of books, like to buy any book that someone recommends or that looks interesting, and just not to care about the money for that, or likewise when my kids, who are both big readers, do that, not to care, like, or to be, my son went to Columbia to study creative writing and English literature, and those colleges now, you can spend $300,000 on 4 years of college here in the US. And so for me, there's not even a moment of hesitation about spending money on my kids' education. That to me is just so profoundly important and valuable. So it's not that the money means the same to each of us. It's that you have to look at your life and say, what do I actually value? What's worth it to me? And that is something I clearly got from my parents, because my parents valued education so massively and learning for its own sake. So I think if there's any kind of takeaway from this long, rambling, discursive answer to your question, Vishal, it's that I think you want to look at your life and say, what actually constitutes a rich life for me? Like, is it the beautiful car? Is it, and for some people, like, they really just love the design of cars, and they, I can appreciate a beautiful car. I appreciate a beautiful home. Like, it's important for me to be in a beautiful space, not a fancy space, but kind of a beautiful space. And it's important for me to have control over my time, my projects, who I hang out with, what I read, things like that. And this is a struggle constantly. I'm constantly failing at all of these things, and I'm overwhelmed and stressed and have too many things to do. And I always yearn to have this peace that I don't quite have. But to structure your life in a way that's true to who you are, that's I think the real gift of money. That's the biggest gift of the money. And then not having to worry about the next bill. or not having to worry about picking up the check for dinner when your friend comes to stay with you, or paying for paying for your kid to go on vacation or something like that. So it's a it's a it's a complicated, a nuanced answer to your question in a way, because I think it requires self-knowledge to say what the money does for you, but the independence, the ability to live in alignment with you, with who you are, is, I think, what matters. But then also to say you don't necessarily need that much money to do that. Like, how much money does it really require? And then do you want to spend your whole life chasing more and more money so people will be more impressed with who you are? Or that's very out of scorecard stuff. And so I think we're all to different extent kind of prey to that. But it's, I don't know. I hope that's vaguely helpful, despite how rambling I am on this topic.
No, I think very clearly helpful, William. I think that idea that you talked about of defining how much is enough, right, and then not chasing more than you need and more than what is enough, right? And I think that's such an important question that everyone needs to answer over there, right? And we keep chasing money, we keep running after success, right?
And also
Never.
not falling into the fantasy. Sorry to interrupt you. Not falling into the fantasy that somehow, if you reach a certain amount of money, it's going to fill this gaping hole. That you'll feel good about yourself when you reach a certain amount of money, or when you have a big enough house or a flash enough car. I think that's dangerous to. I mean, that's idol worship, right? It's assuming that this very external stuff is going to solve some internal issue for you, and so yeah, it's often I think that you get to a point where you got what you wanted, and then you realize that it didn't do the trick anyway. It didn't make you happy. That's when you start to have to re-examine. And so I think part of what happened to me in my 40s was I'd already become, relatively successful. I'd edited international magazines like the Asian edition of Time, the European edition of Time, and I felt kind of like a big shot for a while. And I would go to India and I'd interview Manmohan Singh when he was prime minister, and I'd interview Donald Tusk in Poland, and and David Cameron in Great Britain, and you'd feel kind of like a big shot. And then when that all kind of fell apart, when I got laid off from Time, then you have to re-examine. You say, well, God, none of that stuff was me. That was Time magazine's reputation, not William Green's reputation. None of that was my identity. And so then you have to go back to the drawing board and say, so what constitutes a happy and successful life for me, independent of the image of a magazine or the splendor of your business title or the size of your bank account? And so in a way it's discovering that the thing you were chasing didn't work is a very powerful thing. But it's as Warren Buffett often says, it's good to learn from your mistakes, but it's better to learn from other people's mistakes. And so if you can avoid the trouble of chasing for decades after money, success, fame, reputation, and then discovering that it didn't make you happy, and you can just watch these other people and say, well, that didn't work, that's very helpful. And so one of the things that came up in my conversation with Ed Thorpe, who, as your listeners will probably know, was not only one of the most successful hedge fund managers of all time. He didn't have a losing quarter in 20 years, but he figured out things like card counting. He was the guy who figured out how to beat the casino at blackjack and then at roulette. I mean, he's absolute genius as a game player. And so I said to him, if you were approaching life as a game, where you were trying to win this game of life, what do you need to know? And one of the things that he said to me is, well, who you spend your time with has to be the most important thing of all. And so you look at that and you're like, oh, okay, so here's a guy who was married for more than 50 years before his first wife passed away, and who's really thought about how to behave honorably and decently and not to gouge his shareholders and the like. And so he's got self-respect, he's got a good reputation, he pursues things that he finds really interesting, and he's put relationships above everything. You look at that and you're like, oh, okay, so if I want to have a happy life, it's not going to be the money that does it. Yes, I want enough money that I'm not going to have to worry, but actually I've got to place a premium on relationships. And that's been very clarifying for me. And so when I'm I had this last week where my daughter was home from college, and she was about to go back to college, and I had all these deadlines, and she said, do you want to go out for ice cream with me? And the answer is no, I really need to do my work. And you're like, my 21-year-old daughter is home and she wants to go out for ice cream with me. And I know from hearing from people like Ed Thorpe that nothing is more important than the people you spend your time with. So I'm like, okay. And so, we go out for ice cream and we sit on this beautiful deck overlooking the Hudson River here in New York. And then we stumbled into a couple of friends and chatted to them. And it's like that. I'll remember that. Whereas I have no idea what the deadline was that I was working on, So just knowing, having a little more clarity about what it is you want to chase, what it is that's actually going to fulfill you, I think is enormously helpful. So I'm just trying to reverse engineer these lives of these people that I'm interviewing or writing about, and to say, to answer that question of Munger's, what works and what doesn't work and why.
No, that's great. I think I completely relate to your idea about chasing what really matters in your life, right? So, as I mentioned to you right before we started recording this conversation, that I quit my job 8 years after I joined it. That was my first and last job, right? And not really sure about what exactly was I going to do in life. I knew that I had to write on value investing. I had to write about Buffett and Munger and bring those lessons in a much more simpler manner to people, right? But one of the biggest reasons for me to quit that job was to stay close to my family, right? In Bombay, there was a lot of travel involved. My work took me like away for a few days in a month, every month, right? So staying close to my family, seeing them daily and whenever I wanted to, right? I think that was one of the most important things that I chased. And hearing
Yeah.
you, I realized that I was so lucky to have identified those priorities in my life pretty early, right? So
You
I could
also
have done it
figured
even
out
earlier.
something. I suspect you figured out something really important, because I was asking you before about your kids' names, and the translation of one of your kids' names was consciousness, if I remember rightly. And that also is something that I think I figured out in writing the epilogue of my book, where I was talking about what makes for a happy and abundant life, and the role that money does and doesn't play in it. And it struck me that it all comes down to consciousness, that your inner life, the way that you think, is really ultimately going to determine whether you have a happy and abundant and successful life. And this idea that your consciousness is really what counts runs through so many spiritual and philosophical traditions that I think it has to be true. When you see something in Stoicism, Buddhism, Kabbalah, Hinduism, all of these different paths, that's a pretty powerful confirmation to me. And so one of the things I was writing about in the epilogue was about this lesson that Bill Miller drew from the Stoic philosophers, which is when Bill was going through this terrible period in 2008, 2009, where his assets under management went down from something like 77 billion to 800 million, and his reputation was tarnished by this mistake that he made during the financial crisis, and 100 people were laid off because of an analytical mistake that he made. And he felt kind of terrible about it. I was asking him how he dealt with it. And Bill, who's a utterly brilliant and very honest and smart and thoughtful guy, who had studied philosophy as a postgraduate student, and recently gave $75 million to his old philosophy department at college as a gift. He turned to the Stoic philosophers for emotional strength. And one of the great lessons of the Stoic philosophers is that you can't control things like your reputation and all of your external circumstances, how people will judge you, what they'll think about you. And so Bill said, yeah, but I can control my own behavior, my integrity, whether I'm honest about my mistakes, whether I learn from my mistakes, whether I persevere in the face of this pain and this public shame and failure. And so what I was trying to show there was the way Bill took control over his inner life, over behaving honorably, drawing strength from this lesson from the Stoics that what you have control of is your inner state, your integrity, your own intention, your own attitude. And so to an extraordinary degree, Bill recovered and had this amazing decade after that, where his fund was in the top 1% of all funds. And people who actually stuck with him got their money back and more. But a lot of people, of course, as investors always do, abandoned faith at the bottom and locked in their losses and didn't get the recovery, didn't get the rebound. But that idea of taking control of your own inner landscape, your consciousness, that's also absolutely central to having a happy life. And so I end the book writing about Arnold van den Berg, who I think embodies this beautifully. Here's someone who had every reason to be miserable. Grew up in hiding in an orphanage during the Holocaust as a Jewish kid from Amsterdam at a period when the Nazis had invaded Holland, and comes out of this orphanage malnutritioned, barely able to walk. I mean, he used to shuffle on his knees at the age of 6, and his parents were in Auschwitz and miraculously survived. Came out, he couldn't even recognize them by the time they came out, and they could barely recognize him because he was so emaciated and so small. And so here's a guy who had every reason to be bitter. He'd lost 39 members of his family. Gets to school in America once his parents, refugees to America, lives in a very poor area in East Los Angeles and gets beaten up at school constantly, gets beaten up by his father. First wife leaves him for another man. I mean, he had so much reason to be full of rage and bitterness and sadness and depression, and yet turned his life around to an astonishing degree by taking control of his inner landscape. And I know Arnold has been a guest on your show as well, Vishal, and I talked to him on my podcast recently about how to gain control of your inner landscape. But that, to me, again, when I was looking at this question of what actually makes for an abundant life, this I think was almost the most important conclusion for me, was that it all comes down to your consciousness. It all comes down to your inner landscape. And so again, we know from what we were discussing before that relationships are going to be key to happiness. We know that you want to have a certain amount of money so you have financial independence, that you want to live a life that's aligned with who you are. But we also know from people like the poet Milton, who said that the mind can make a heaven of hell or hell of heaven, that or Shakespeare, who said nothing is either good or bad, but thinking makes it so. And so we've known always, from great poets to great philosophers, that it's your mental state that's really going to determine the quality of your life. And so that, again, had a very powerful practical impact on me, because in the same way that I'm saying, well, I know that relationships matter, so I better go out for ice cream with my daughter instead of just focusing on my work and neglecting my daughter. I also know that I have to do things that are going to foster my own equanimity, and that's not a side issue. It's an absolutely central question. And so if I'm learning from the greatest investors what it's going to take for me to have a happy and successful and truly abundant life, one of the key areas I have to focus on is my own consciousness. So again, I'm going to have to figure out, do I meditate? Do I pray? Do I read philosophy? Do I read spiritual books? Do I walk in nature? What is it that's going to nourish my soul in some sense? And that again is it's so individual and so subjective, but it's got to be a central question, I think. And earlier in my life, when I was so busy trying to impress everyone and uh, you know, climb up and and get promotions and make more money and have more independence and the like. That those things were really important, but I don't think I paid enough attention to these other things of achieving internal equanimity. And so for example, I'm going on a 7 or 8 day meditation retreat in August, and it's the first time I've ever done it. And I'm not a person who finds it easy to sit still. Well, actually, I'm pretty good at sitting and lazing around and reading and eating, but it's not easy for me to sit and still my mind. And I'm constantly thinking about the future and planning and regretting the past and stuff like that. And so for me, actually, to rewire my brain and to think how can I change the way my mind operates so that I'm more present in this moment and so that I'm relishing my life in this moment. And that's become increasingly important to me. And given that I only have time probably to do 3 or 4 things decently in life, maybe it's to be a good husband and father, or maybe it's to share ideas from investors in books or podcast or whatever format. What else is there? I have to take my physical health seriously, because if you're unhealthy, it's very hard to have a vital and happy and cheerful and sharing and good, abundant life. So grudgingly, I have to get on a Peloton bike or whatever, or walk in the woods or whatever it is. And then there's this aspect of your consciousness, your inner landscape, your spiritual life, whatever you want to call it. That for me, I have this unromantic image for this. I'm like, what are the buckets in my life there? So if there are like 4 buckets, and then there are friendships and relationships and the like that I'm leaving out, and you're having to make some hard decisions here, because you don't have time to do all of these things well. But just knowing that inner life has to be one of those buckets for you to have a sustainable, happy life is really important, because it's not just in the markets that eventually you're going to have trouble. Eventually there's going to be a bear market that, where everything comes undone, or your career, there's going to be a time where you get laid off, or where you have a financial worry, or there's going to be a health issue, God forbid, all of these things. There are always going to be these vicissitudes, these occasional storms, these dips that you have to survive. And so you want to be thinking about your equanimity and your resilience in advance. And so there's a bit in, I think it's in the chapter that I write about Charlie Munger, where I interviewed a friend of mine, Ken Schubenstein, he was a very successful investor who's now become a neuroscientist, a neurologist. And he said to me that there are about 4 things that we know scientifically help you to think well, right? So give you optimal for your brain. So things like good nutrition, good sleep, good exercise, and meditation. We know that those 4 things benefit the brain. But what Ken said to me that nobody I've ever heard say before, I'm sure they have said it, but it seemed to me a very profound observation, is he said, with these good habits like meditation, you want to do them before the storm. He said, it's great to wait. It's fine to wait, then be in the middle of the storm and say, oh my God, I better meditate. But he said, it's much more powerful if before the storm comes, you already have these good habits in place. And so this whole idea knowing that building this strong foundation of equanimity through good habits, this has become more and more important to me. And so then you know that meditation is going to help. You know that exercise is going to help. You know that having a good ecosystem of friendships and close family members is going to help, because when things go wrong, being able to turn to a friend and say, I'm really struggling, or being able to be candid with your wife and say, I feel so overwhelmed and stressed, and I feel like I've failed people or failed myself or whatever. Having those relationships in place so that you can be candid and so that people love you and cut you some slack in your moments where you're behaving terribly or where you've lost the plot. That's really valuable. So I think you were onto something hugely important when you used the name that means consciousness with your child, because I had a great Kabbalah teacher called Rav Berg, who just would say over and over again, consciousness is everything. And so your inner life is going to determine your reality. If you're full of appreciation, if you're full of gratitude, if you look at setbacks and you say, this was for my benefit. What can I learn from this? How did it benefit me? So when we were talking before about me getting laid off, one of the things I was thinking as you were talking about your kids when you gave up your job was, one of the great gifts of my getting laid off is I was there with my children throughout a really key part of their childhood. So in the first few years of their life, I was so busy working 70, 80 hours a week at Time Magazine that I kind of neglected my kids. And when I was available with them, I was so exhausted that I wasn't really present with them, or I was on my BlackBerry or whatever, checking my email in those days. And so one of the great gifts was that I was able to be there, picking up my kids from school every day, being there with my daughter every day when she came back from school. An amazing gift throughout the key years of their adolescence and the like. And so that habit of just looking at everything as a gift, everything as a lesson, every challenge is something that enables you to grow. That consciousness totally transforms your life. Whereas I think earlier in my life, I just thought it's all random, it's all chaotic, there's no meaning to it all. It's all just Darwinian competition in this jungle, and it's kind of meaningless. And it was kind of a really sad way to live. And I think I increasingly feel like your consciousness creates your reality anyway. And so whether I'm right or not, I think it's a better way to live to say every time something challenging happens, this was a gift for me. What am I going to learn from it? How am I going to grow from it, or grow from it, or to become more appreciative, to become more loving, kinder, more compassionate? All of these things. It's the inner game, the inner landscape that's ultimately going to determine whether you're happy, not the size of your bank account. So when I was living in London, there was one point where I was living in Belgravia, this beautiful area with these lovely, I think probably 18th or 19th century white stucco houses, gorgeous. And you would look out and there would be Ferraris and Maseratis and Porsches and Lamborghinis on the street. And I don't think it was healthy for me, because it puts you in a position where, even though I felt like a big shot and was editing this big international magazine, I was reminded the whole time that I was probably the poorest person on the street. It's not healthy. And so it wasn't a matter of living in the grand house that made me happy. I'm actually happier now when I live in a really nice but kind of unpretentious house on a street that's pretty unpretentious. And when I go walk my dog, I walk past these houses that are really pretty modest on the street next to us. And so the benchmarking makes me happier, because I'm not benchmarking myself against trillionaires. I'm benchmarking myself against regular people. And so I look then at my life and I'm like, God, I'm so unbelievably lucky. And so again, it's not about the numbers. It's not about the size of your bank account. It's actually your inner state that's determining whether you feel like you have enough. And this is why Tom Gayner said that his father was the richest man in the world. He had enough.
That's right. I think one of the most valuable insights which I got out from what you spoke, right, is the idea of focusing on those three or four key things that you want to do in life, right? And I've always wondered what keeps Warren, Charlie, and other people like him, right, other successful investors like him, so happy and living for such a long life, right? Despite all the bad eating habits, for example, for
Huh.
Warren and Charlie, right? What makes them
Yeah.
so happy in life, right? Now, going by what you say, right, I can probably connect the dots over there that they've focused on very few things in life, the most important things in life, and they've kept at it, right, without wavering
Yeah.
from their path. So I think that really connects a dot for me. So that's
Yeah,
valuable.
they're doing what they love, and they do it with people they love and like and admire. And that's a pretty precious thing, right? I mean, they've structured their environment so that it's full of people they enjoy working with and they enjoy playing bridge with and going to the club with and traveling with. And I that's key. Having an environment full of people you like and being able to play the game that you're good at and you enjoy. What could be better?
That's true. That's true. What about writing, William? So I'm sure one of the buckets that's important for you, the three or four important things that you want to do in life, right? I'm sure writing is a part of that. So how has writing given meaning to your life? And a second question is, what are your most important rules of writing so well?
Writing is a complicated subject in the sense that it's not really enjoyable. And so it's not like how to phrase this. It's not like Buffett tap dancing to work every day because he gets to sit there and read and then occasionally buy a stock. Writing is painful and hard for most good writers. And usually when people say, "Oh, I love writing," you're like, "Yeah, right. So you're a rubbish writer." That's your sort of internal dialogue, and maybe it's totally wrong. Um, but writing is just hard, and it so in a way it fits into this other category of things. It illustrates another principle of life that I do write about in the chapter about Nick's sleep, which is the power of deferred gratification. That usually the things that are of real value in our lives don't come that easily. That if you want to become a doctor, you spend years going to medical school and going through those residences where you're working ridiculously. I remember a relative of mine talking about how he used to come home from being on call for in the hospital for whatever 72 hours or something, and he would have a beer in the shower before he went to sleep for a day. I mean, it's hard, right? Same with getting into a great school or college. Usually the things that are really valuable, you have to go against your own nature, your own laziness, push against the pain, running a marathon, exercising. So there's a sense in which, the Kabbalists are very clear about this. They call this restriction. It's going against your own nature, and so if you, yeah, I think it's one of the great principles of life that you have to struggle for the things that are most valuable. And so with writing, I'm kind of torn because it's the most satisfying thing I've ever done professionally. I mean, I feel like this sense of peace and satisfaction that comes from having done this book because I put so much into it. I mean, it took me 5 years basically. And it was really painful. And I didn't take a vacation in 5 years. And I worked mostly 6 days a week. And it was just hard. And you have no idea whether it's going to work out, whether anyone will like it. But the sense of fulfillment at the end independent of how it's done. I mean, I'm really happy that it's done well and that people like it. That's wonderfully rewarding. I can't tell you, but the fact that you look back and you don't have regrets, that there's nothing really that I wish I'd done very differently. I put everything into it. I put heart and soul into it. That's very, very rewarding. But there's also a part of me that's really, if I'm honest about it, scared to approach the mountain again. And so it's simultaneously the most valuable thing I've done professionally, and also remembering how painful it was. I'm not thinking, God, I really want to write another book quickly. And so I'm kind of wondering, I'm a little bit torn. The podcast I'm doing this Richer, Wiser, Happier podcast where I interview a lot of these famous investors. And I still find it stressful because I tend to worry too much about everything and be full of anxiety about things. And I worry that I'll mess up, or that I'll do a bad job, or, I'll be exposed as knowing nothing and being an imposter. I have all of these anxieties still that motivate me and drive me, that are probably not very healthy. But it's still easier than writing. And it's way easier than writing. And so you're taking part of the most enjoyable aspects of writing a book or writing a magazine article, which is the research, studying up on people, learning about their ideas, and then interviewing them. But you don't have the brutality of sitting there on your own in a room for month after month, trying to worry about whether you can find the right word or capture the person's ideas. And so something like the chapter that I wrote about Nick Sleep and Case Zakaria, I probably spent 5 months or so on that chapter, just on that one chapter. And I felt this sense of, here are these guys who've never spoken to the media before. They're totally private. They're absolutely extraordinary. And they've placed their trust in me and never in anybody else to tell their story. And I want to honor that story and do it properly. And there are great lessons on how to live and how to think and how to invest. But I have to capture those ideas in a truthful way, not just a factually accurate way, but in a deeply truthful way. And that's, if you have a scattered mind that's all over the place, as I do, and you're studying lots of different things and reading lots of different things, just reining in all of that material, hundreds of pages of material that you've read, from your interviews, from different books, from all of their annual reports, from interviews with other people, that's a pretty overwhelming task. And likewise, think of what it was like to write about Monish in the first chapter of the book, where I'd been on a 5-day trip across India with Monish, taking notes constantly, non-stop for 5 days. Even, we're on that all-night train ride from Kota to Mumbai, and I'm sitting there taking notes as we're eating and as we're chatting in our bunk bed. And then we're in the car going to Dakshina, to the various schools where he's funding these kids' education. And I'm sitting there in the car, in the back seat, taking notes as we're swerving in between trucks and stuff. And I'm kind of gasping and wondering if I'm going to survive. And then you're standing interviewing someone over lunch, nonstop for 5 days. So you can imagine, you get home, you have all of those notes. Then you have your notes from probably at that point 2 trips to Omaha for the Berkshire Hathaway annual meeting that I'd done with Guy and Monish. Then a trip to Irvine, California to interview Monish in his office. Then dinner or lunch in New York with Monish. That I'd been when he'd been talking privately to kids in a class at Columbia Business School. I'd been there. I'd been with him in Israel. I'd been with Guy. I'd been on a private plane with him and Guy back from Omaha, talking about the inner scorecard. So I have hundreds of pages of notes. And then I'm trying to synthesize all of that stuff and say to people, this is what it means. And so at one point during that task, early in writing the book, I was writing to Monish about how kind of overwhelmed I was by this task. And he writes back to me and he says, William, you were born to synthesize this material. And it was kind of wonderfully heartening and encouraging. And I do feel like in some way I was born to synthesize this material, that I'm not saying it in a self-congratulatory way. I think I was put in this position where somehow these extraordinary minds, these extraordinary investors have placed their trust in me. And they've given me incredible access and incredible information, incredible insight. And I feel like I felt particularly while writing this book, this mounting sense of responsibility, where I was like, what? I have this one shot where perhaps I can say something useful, where perhaps I can synthesize these ideas from people like Monish or Charlie or Nick Sleep and actually say something helpful that could affect people's lives. And let me try to do it in a truthful, honorable, honest, and kind of beautiful way. And once that's your standard, it becomes kind of overwhelming because the stakes just got higher and higher. And I'm not trying to be self-righteous or self-congratulatory in this, because some people will look at the book and they'll be like, really, that's what you came up with after all that effort? But that was what I was trying to do. I mean, I had this sense of, I may never get this opportunity again to say something really worthwhile. Like maybe I only have one really good book in me, and this is my chance to synthesize what more than 40 or 50 of the greatest investors have told me in hundreds of hours of interviews. And then you also had this sense of, going back and looking at old notes from interviews with people like Peter Lynch or Sir John Templeton or Bill Ruane, these legendary figures, and thinking, I can't even write at length about these people. There isn't space. And so there was also the pain of having to say, all right, I'll write at length about Sir John Templeton, but I'm not going to write at length about this other absolutely extraordinary person who talked to me. And so that was painful. There was a sort of sense of betrayal or disappointment. I mean, I've interviewed Bill Miller for probably the best part of 100 hours over the last 20 years and 22 years. And so I was only scraping the surface in writing about Bill in this book. And so just the pain and angst and an intellectual brain ache of trying to synthesize this material is kind of excruciating. But then the sense of satisfaction when you feel like you've cracked something, when you feel like you're like, that's what it means. That's a very beautiful thing. And so there were moments, for example, where I was writing about someone like Joel Greenblatt, and I was trying to explain, here's how he broke the code of how to invest. And then I would be saying, okay, so really what this is about is simplicity, that you have this great investor who figured out how to simplify the game of investing. And then I'd start to think, but this is totally connected to simplicity in all of these other areas of life. And you'd start to explain, well, simplicity runs through science, it runs through spirituality, it runs through business. You can see it with companies like Google, Apple, simplicity, deep simplicity. And so there's there's something just really intellectually thrilling about making these connections and feeling like, so simplicity is a master principle of life. Or figuring out, as I wrote the Nick Sleep Case Sicaria chapter, so deferred gratification is a master principle of life. So there's something both brutally difficult and overwhelming about writing if you really deeply care about it, and at the same time exquisitely joyful and valuable about it, but mostly when you're done. And that makes it, for me, for me, it makes it a difficult compulsion, because I think it's the most valuable thing I can do, probably. Um, but it's quite hard to volunteer for that pain again. And so it may just be that I need somehow to change, um, my consciousness about it, to change my mindset. And that helped. It's not helpful to keep telling yourself how painful it is. You kind of get psyched out of it. Um, so it helped when I started to focus and think, how can I would say to myself again and again, as I would be working, then I'd go off to walk, and I'd be thinking about this stuff obsessively. I'd start to think, what will be most helpful to the reader in this chapter? And I would, and I'm kind of a mystic at heart, so I would be like, my inner monologue is like, please show me what I'm supposed to tell people in this chapter. Please let this chapter be helpful to people. And so there is something kind of weirdly spiritual about it, where you're trying to you're trying to share something that's deeply true, not just that's accurate, that's factually accurate, but that's deeply true. And you're doing it through the eyes of these people who are incredible thinkers, and so they've studied the most important things in life and figured out a lot. And so you're trying to convey what they believe and what they've worked out, and then add what you've figured out. And I had a beautiful conversation with one of the great money managers I wrote about, who I won't name, who said to me, we 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 drunk some wine, and in vino veritas, right? You tell the truth when you've drunk a bit of wine. And he sort of said something to me about how you understood my mental models, and he said it um, in such a sweet, honest way, that it was like, I think what he was really saying is, nobody ever really understood me before. And this is a really brilliant guy who's a really deep thinker, who I don't think I I don't I think it's lonely being that brilliant. And it's actually quite hard to find people who truly understand the ideas that obsess you. And he felt that I'd understood his ideas. And so there was a sense of kind of deep gratitude. And again, I'm not saying it to be self-congratulatory. It's like, that's a really beautiful thing, to feel like you've understood someone's inner essence. That's so there's deep satisfaction to the writing when it works. It's kind of everything, because you're sharing ideas that you think can help other people and that help you as well. But God, it's hard. It's really hard.
Completely agree. I think I also agree with your point about writing being so transformative, right, in your entire journey. So as I mentioned, I wrote a book last year, and it was a transformative journey for me personally. Just given that the entire process led me to a lot of reflections, a lot of pauses on my own life, and whether I was actually living what I was writing about, and how I could get better as a person by just implementing what I wrote, right? So that was based on some of the wisest people who have walked on this planet.
Can I
I'm
ask you
sure.
what if I turn the table on you for a moment? Was there one idea that you drew from it that really changed the way that you live?
No, yeah. So I think an idea of about equanimity, right? I wrote an idea about a note on equanimity, right? How do you deal with life's terrible situations, right? In terms of positive situations you get through in life, right? But in terms of dealing with terrible situations, how not to beat yourself up, like not indulging in self pity, like Charlie Munger has talked about
Mm.
so many times in life, right? Uh, I thought I knew it, right? But I also realized when I look back at my life while I was writing that chapter, there were moments where I was spitting myself. I was not. I probably did not deal with that situation in a better manner than I could have, right? So just writing about that idea, just researching on the idea of equanimity, right? It holds ground, right? There are a lot of lessons on equanimity that also comes from philosophy, right? Even when
Mm.
I study, right, Hindu philosophy, Hindu scriptures, right? There's a word called samatvam, right? Samatvam is a Sanskrit word. It means equanimity, right? You have to think, you have to behave in a similar manner, which is true to yourself, which is true to your character, whatever the situations be, right? So being an investor, thinking about investing, writing about investing, teaching about investing, I have talked about equanimity, but when I was writing the chapter, right, it really led me to reflect more on how I have dealt with equanimity in my whole life. And that was completely, I would not say completely, it was transformative for me, that I need to be more equanimous in life. I need to deal well with the situations which are dealt to me, right, which are not to my liking probably, right? But in hindsight, what we realize is that we don't really get in life what we need, but what we really deserve, right? So over a period of time, so we just need to be in the flow. That's the idea, right? Like a river, right? A river passes through all the obstacles, right? But the whole purpose of the river is just to flow. In the sense that that was a lesson for me, right? The entire idea of living a life, or the entire purpose of life, is just to flow, rather than thinking about which direction you're going, what are the goals in life, right? You just need to flow, like. And I could associate that so well with the lessons which I have learned from so many people you mentioned, right? Guy Spier, Warren Buffett, Charlie Munger, Howard Marks, right? They've just flowed in life. They have not really worried about what people are thinking about them, right? What the outcomes they're going to achieve in life, right? They just flowed, and uh, they have been equanimous through all those situations that have troubled so many other people, and that has caused a differentiation. So yeah, that was one big lesson for me.
Yeah, I love what you said there, and I have lots of thoughts on it. And we could go in any direction, but there's a beautiful Hebrew phrase that I'll mispronounce, which is gamzula tova, which means and this too is for the best. And so and there, so one of the greatest, I mean, the Kabbalists sometimes say that he was the greatest soul who ever lived, was this guy Rabbi Akiva. And his teacher was called the Gamtsu Ish means man. So he was the, and this too is for the best man. And he would just say over and over again, and this too is for the best, this is for the good, this is for my benefit. And when the ancient temple was destroyed and it was burning, and this is kind of the holiest place for the Jews, Rabbi Akiva started to dance as he's watching it. And so there's this sense. So think of what we were saying before about the power of your consciousness. Here's the ultimate adversity. And Rabbi Akiva has such inner strength that he starts to dance in the face of disaster. And I think that points you towards some great truth about how we're supposed to, the ultimate consciousness that you can reach, where you have this sense that everything is for your benefit, that nothing, that even though things seem dark, there's this kind of inner light to it. And so one of the things the Kabbalists would say is that every great blessing comes within this sort of this sort of this there's this outer cover that seems like a curse. And so, and likewise, when I study Tibetan Buddhism, which I find very beautiful, I was reading something last week that was talking about, I'll probably misquote it, but it's something to do with the great equality, this sense that you can sit in this state, you sit within this fluidity where everything's swirling around you, all of this craziness. And yet there's this great equality where whether things are good or bad in terms of their appearance, there's the sense of the great equality. You're okay with it all. And so I think somehow that's what we're working towards, is this ability to see. I mean, if I'm honest about it, I'm slightly embarrassed to say this, but in a sense, it's to get to the place where you see only light. And that, I think, I think when you see these great spiritual giants who achieved that in whatever path, it's like they planted a flag, halfway up Mount Everest or at the top of Mount Everest, and they're like, here, look, this is what you can get to. This is what the path is. And so, I think one of the things that happens along the way, from my experience from low down in the foothills of the Himalayas, is that uh, when you get smashed and you're going through these difficult periods, whether it's getting laid off or a health challenge or a financial challenge or a market challenge or whatever it might be, a failure in your career or difficulty in a relationship or whatever, often a few years later, you look back and you say, what an unbelievable gift that was. And I think gradually you have more and more data points that show you that it was always for your benefit, or it somehow miraculously turned out for your benefit. And yet, we find it incredibly difficult to do it at the moment that it's happening. And so I've often wondered if maybe the challenge is to shift towards being able to see it in the moment that you're in the fight with your wife, or that your kid is driving you nuts, or that you're totally flooded emotionally because your portfolio just fell to some degree that you can't believe, or you just embarrass yourself at work by saying something incredibly dumb or getting humiliated in public or whatever. In that moment, to be able to see Gamsula Tova, this too is for the best. That I think is what we're working towards. And that's so when I think of Rabbi Akiva dancing by the temple as it burns, that's the consciousness that he got to. And a friend of mine who's a very serious practitioner of Tibetan Buddhist meditation was talking to me about a teacher she knew. Maybe she had just read about him or heard about him back in Tibet when it was being dismantled and overrun by China, and his monastery was being destroyed. And she said this guy was famous for kind of smiling as they're destroying his sacred monastery, and he's saying, wow, you guys work really hard and you're so good at this, and somehow to have that sense of the great equality, the freedom to be able to see that anything that happens is for the best. And I would have really struggled with this intellectually 15 years ago, more so than now, where I would have looked at this and I would have been like, what an idiot I am. Like, what a dupe for being so puerile. Like, maybe it just sucks. Maybe it's just terrible. Maybe it's all random. And maybe it's all meaningless. And people who look for meaning in all of these chaotic, terrible things are just deluding themselves. And just because they think that there's meaning doesn't mean there is. And so that would have been my attitude before. And so I'm conscious of the fact that maybe I'm delusional in believing that there's light in everything. But I think if your consciousness is creating your reality, if Rav Berg was right that consciousness is everything, then you choose your ideas. And this is something that the pragmatic philosophers that Bill Miller is fascinated with would talk about. They would say ideas are like forks and spoons, they're tools. And so you might as well pick an idea that's useful. And a really useful idea is to say, everything's from the light. It's all for my benefit. And I see this with Tony Robbins, who I became friendly with over the years, who would often say, life doesn't happen to you, it happens for you. And Templeton would say the same thing. Sir John Templeton would say over and over again things like, this comes to bless me. And so when I first met Templeton, I would have thought, here's this sanctimonious, holy roller, pious guy who's really smart, but he's kind of an idiot for believing all of these things. And now increasingly, I'm like, well, that attitude, if ideas are like forks and tools and hammers and stuff, you want to pick a good idea. And so to pick an idea that when the challenge is coming, this comes to bless me, maybe it's foolish, but it turns out to be true. Because I think when you adopt that attitude again and again in your life, when you look for the gift within every curse, the blessing within every curse, you start to find it constantly. And so maybe you close the gap so that instead of waiting 5 years and looking back and saying, God, I'm glad that happened. Maybe you get to a point where as it's happening, there's a part of you that's getting crushed, and there's a part of you that's saying, I know this is for my benefit. I know this is going to be okay. And maybe that's just a survival strategy. Maybe it's something kind of wired into us to help us get through difficult times, but it works. And I think your the mind is like a muscle, right? And so the more you practice certain ways of thinking, the stronger that consciousness becomes. So when you keep pounding these ideas into your mind that this is for the best, that there's light in this too, that we live in this kind of world of illusion where you see all this suffering, you see all of the pain. It's real in some sense, right? I mean, you see the situation in Ukraine. It's brutal. It's tremendously deep suffering. But you also want to have this, you also want to operate in this other realm simultaneously, where like, I feel that the world is getting better. I don't feel disempowered. I feel that I can help. I feel that, so maybe these things are delusional, but I think they're very powerful delusions if they are delusions.
That's right. I think again, as part of the book, there's another thing, another piece of wonderful writing which I read. Right, and there's a book called "The World Is a Narrow Bridge." Right. So, and since you mentioned about
Mm,
Hebrew philosophy, right? So there's a scene in this book where Eva and Murphy, they're the two young prophets of God. Right. They're sent on a mission that terrifies them, and as they begin the mission, both Eva and Murphy are approached by Satan, who is even sent by the God, right, to give them their final instructions before they start their dangerous journey. And the instruction that Satan gives them, actually, so I don't really understand Hebrew, but the translated version is that the world is a narrow bridge, and the most
yeah,
important thing is to not be afraid, right? So, and as you
yeah.
mentioned, counting things that come your way as blessings, right? I think that's some one of the most important things that you can do as you cross this narrow bridge of world.
Yeah, and there's a very beautiful song that you sing sometimes. That's I'll get it wrong, but the lyric is something like "Kol helam husha geshe sar me'od," and it means the whole world is just a narrow bridge, but the main thing is to have no fear at all. And when you sing that song with a group of people, and um, and you repeat it over and over again. I mean, it's something like Kol Holam Kulo Geshe San Mehod, and you do it over and over again. It becomes kind of ecstatic, and and I think what it is, the people who sang this, um, there was a particular great sage who wrote that song. Um, I there's something about the defiance in the face of adversity that here were these Jews who were persecuted for thousands of years, and they're saying in tremendous defiance as this community together. Think what it would have been like to sing this song during the Holocaust or to sing this song during other periods of exile. Um, to say the main thing is to have no fear at all. So in defiance of all of the suffering, to say, no, I trust that it's going to be okay. That's a tremendous act of defiance and courage. And so when you're singing those songs and kind of connecting to your ancestors who sung those songs as well, there's something extraordinarily powerful about it. That there's a defiance, and there's a beautiful service once a month on the new moon, where I think, I mean, my knowledge of the Old Testament is not great, but I think the first commandment was basically to mark the new moon, to honor the new moon, and you sing some of these very ancient songs that I think go back, some of the lyrics, to Psalms, right? So what is it, 3,000 years or whatever it was. And you feel this sense of defiance in the face of suffering, that the ability to persevere regardless. There's one, I actually have one on my wall here that I printed out once because it was so extraordinary. I have so it says mina metza karatiya, and it means, from my distress I cried out to the Creator. The Creator answered me in His expansiveness. The Creator is with me. I shall not fear. What can man do to me? So it says, Adonai li lo ira, Maya se li Adam, which means the Creator is with me. I shall not fear. What can man do to me? And you sing that, and in a group of people. I mean, I did it recently, in the midst of COVID, and we were coming back on a Shabbat, on a Saturday morning, and it was the new moon. You're singing that, and you're in tears as you sing that, because you see this insane perseverance in the face of adversity. And so in that epilogue, when I'm writing about Bill Miller, I say at the end, look, there are two lessons here for me. And one is basically the great Buddhist truth, which is everyone suffers. And the other for me is that there's great honor in the simple virtue of perseverance. And when I said something like that, that's a very short and very simple sentence. And I'm pretty sure I'm quoting it exactly word for word with both of those things. Everyone suffers, and there's great honor in the simple virtue of perseverance. I mean that. I mean, that's something where I've wrestled with his story for a long time. And I'm like, that's what I want to take from it. And so when I'm going through a difficult time, I can go back to read that epilogue, and I can be like, okay, I need to remember this, that there's great honor in the simple virtue of perseverance. And there are times in your life where that's kind of all you can do, where, you're going through the ringer to such an extent, and the pain is so great that you're like, all I can do is persevere. But I think when you see someone like Bill coming through that period and kind of having this extraordinary redemption, it points you towards these greater truths that we see again and again. You see it with Charlie Munger, who went through that period where his first son died, I think, of leukemia when he was about 9. It kind of, I think, probably led to his divorce. He lost all of his money paying for the medical bills, and he said that he basically was having to lie to his child and tell him that he wasn't going to die and that he was going to get better. And he said his child kind of knew that he was lying, and that it was just torture, just absolute misery. And so you look at these great lives of people we tend to lionize, and we often assume that it was an upward trajectory, a straight upward trajectory. And what I'm trying to show is, no. They all went through the ringer. They all experienced pain. And that's a very humanizing thing to realize, because it makes you, there's no reason why a Bill Miller or a Charlie Munger, just because they're a billionaire, is unworthy of our empathy and compassion. They suffer too, because everyone suffers. But it's also incredibly heartening, because it means when you're going through a difficult time yourself, you're like, oh yeah, this is part of the human experience. This is what the Buddhists talk about when they talk about dukkha, suffering, or unsatisfactoriness, it's sometimes translated as. It's just part of the human condition. And so then you start to think, well, so I need to have a little bit of self-compassion, because this is my time in the barrel, and I'm suffering too, and I'm imperfect, and I'm human. But then you also know that when you go through this with courage and determination and tenacity and a desire to learn, you come out the other side, and it's good. And I also love that line from that thing that I was reading to you, where it says, the Creator is with me, I shall not fear. What can man do to me? There's something kind of amazingly defiant about that. It's like, nobody can touch me. Like, at some level, you can get to a level of consciousness where nobody can touch you, because you have such deep trust that there's as a teacher of mine used to say, the light is in the business. Like, even in these moments where it seems totally dark, it's like, no, the light is in the business. And so that deep trust that it's going to be okay, I think is transformational. And I think in some ways, because I came from this kind of cerebral, secular background, it was very, very hard for me to embrace ideas like this. So when I first interviewed someone like Templeton, I found his religiosity very, very unappealing, because there was also something kind of sanctimonious about it. And when I saw him, I mean, he was very courteous and very polite and very civil and very generous in his dealings with me. But when I saw him be rude to me, for example, or sort of smack me down at one point, I'm like, yep, hypocrite. I could see the hypocrisy in it. And it kind of made me, it reinforced my prejudice against religiosity, somewhat unfairly, because I think he was also incredibly generous and genteel and kind and patient with me. But increasingly, I look at it and I think, God, I was this really arrogant, opinionated 30-year-old thinking I knew everything. And I looked at him and I thought, what a schmuck for believing all of this stuff and being so sanctimonious and self-righteous. And increasingly, I came to just think, oh, he figured out stuff just so much earlier than I figured it out. And so in a way, when I was writing about Templeton, I was grappling with my own shame and embarrassment at having been too obtuse and too arrogant to listen to what he was saying. And so, but it's difficult because a lot of these things that we're discussing can sound kind of sanctimonious and pious and like we're proselytizing. And also, so much of it's unprovable, right? And so here we are engaged in this game where we're studying the greatest investors who are incredibly rational, and we're trying to become more rational. And yet, there's this whole area of life that's not really that amenable to rational analysis. Ultimately, to say I'm placing my faith in a creator, or in the idea of redemption, or in the idea that there's light within darkness, that sounds kind of intellectually indefensible sometimes. And yet, I think that's the direction in which freedom lies. Where and so for me, I've gone through a kind of battle with myself over many years, where in a way it's like dismantling the rational intellectual side of myself to try to understand this deeper truth. And at the same time, I'm trying to understand how to do rational intellectual thinking better by explaining what people like Munger and Buffett do, and Howard Marks, and all of these incredibly rational, lucid thinkers. But I think the deeper truth, you kind of know it. There's a great Kabbalist called Rav Ashlag who would talk about the certainty beyond logic, and he was a genius. He was utterly brilliant intellectually, but this idea of the certainty beyond logic, that's what Rabbi Akiva was exercising in the moment when he's dancing next to the burning temple. And so that's kind of part of the challenge, right? Is I have a friend who studies both Judaism and Buddhism very seriously, and he spends his mornings meditating, but then he goes to a Chabad synagogue on Saturdays, and he says, I'm just running two different programs. And that's a really interesting image. And so in some ways, there's one program where we're trying to become more rational and logical, like Buffett, Munger, and Howard Marks. And then there's this other program where I think you're trying to see what's actually true, which is more a sort of ineffable, indescribable kind of spiritual truth that underlies all of this stuff. And I think you touch it, you sense it when you see Munger being kind and sharing and loving, and you see and you see the perseverance of a Bill Miller in the face of failure and public shame. You get glimpses of this other reality, but you can't really describe it, and it's painful, and it makes me it makes me feel a little bit foolish to talk about this stuff. But I don't know. I think it's probably more important than than the other stuff I write about how to get rich.
Those are, I think, valuable insights, William. I just realized we've been talking for 2 hours and about investors, and we have not talked about investing at all.
Ha.
And I must also confess that I think this has been one of the most meditative conversations for me in many years. So I thank you so
Oh,
much with all my heart
thank
for
you
that.
for letting me opine on all of these subjects instead of talking about investing, which I'm not very good at anyway. So really, you should be interviewing the great investors about how to get rich. I wish I were better at it myself.
I'm sure you're doing great at it. I'm sure. I'm sure the kind of stuff that you've written about yourself, about your book, about the investors you profile. I'm sure you are up there, right? So
I'm smart enough to know that I need to outsource it because I can see the difference between them and me. And so one of the practical revelations that I got from working on the book was just to say I'm not them, and I don't have their wiring, I don't have their temperament. I'm not as obsessed with this stuff as they are, and so I should give my money to people who are better wired for this game. And so actually, that's been incredibly helpful. I ended up I own a couple of index funds that I've owned forever. Um, I own Berkshire, uh, and I have probably 3 funds that are run by other people, and so that's a that's an acceptance of my own limitation. And so I think that's part of what I've learned about investing through this process of working on the book is you one of the great teachings from Munger is you want to play games that you can win. And so for me, I don't have the temperament. I'm not unemotional. I'm not super rational. Uh, and so it's better for me to give the money to people who are wired for this game. And I don't think Munger wants to sit around reading 850-page Russian novels that I'm reading at the moment, and so that's not the game he was built to win. And so so that so I think if there's a practical takeaway for any of your listeners who've managed to survive this long into the conversation, it's really to think carefully about what game you're built for. You know, why would someone be as maniacal as I was about writing this book? That's a game I was built for. You know, as Moni said, you were born to synthesize this material. To some extent, he was buttering me up and encouraging me, and to some extent, I think that's actually true. So figure out what you're interested in that's almost totally illogical. What you would do regardless of whether you were paid for it or not, because it's just profoundly interesting, and then figure out what you're good at, um, and then really focus intensely on getting better at um, that game. So you're building your circle of competence by learning other stuff at the same time, building other skills. But I think having that somewhat narrow focus on what you're really good at and really passionate at, like most truths, this sounds like a total platitude, but I think it's really important, and I see that with people like Munger, Buffett, Monish, Guy. Like they just Guy less so. Um, Guy's interested in a rich life, and so Guy does things that aren't necessarily going to make him better at investing, but that make him a better human. Um, and that's one reason why I love him. I mean, it's great. Uh, um, but I think on the whole, you have to be kind of maniacally focused uh, on the one thing that you're really great at and that you're really built for. Um, and I don't know. Maybe that's why it gets tiring. I mean, it's interesting that Bill Miller finally is thinking he's going to retire at the end of the year. It's hard to keep playing the same game over and over again. But I think in his case, he wants to. I think probably managing his own money gives him much more freedom and flexibility, not having to apologize to anyone if a stock goes down.
So Willem, we are at like 2 hour 15 minutes of time. So how much more time do you have?
I can talk for a few more minutes. You have a couple more questions?
I have a lot of questions, but I'll keep it at for the next probably 10 minutes or so. 10 minutes or
I mean,
so.
do you
Is that
feel
fine?
like anybody actually has the energy and interest to hear more from us?
I created this podcast for that one listener who has the energy,
Ha.
right? And that is me. So it's in my
Okay.
best self interest. And there are a lot of people who write to me and who tell me about the idea of keeping long talks, right? Which is so
Yeah.
much absent in today's world of instant
Yeah, that's true.
gratification. So there are a lot of people.
Sure.
But
So
I'll keep
yeah,
it for the next few minutes. So I
ask
think
me one or two more questions that are important to you, and I'm happy to do my
fair
best to
enough.
answer them.
Fair enough. Fair enough. So, my question is about the introduction of your book, and you wrote, and I quote, that I've come to realize it's helpful to view investing in life as games in which we must consciously and consistently seek to maximize our odds of success. The rules are elusive and the outcome uncertain, but there are smart ways to play and dumb ways to play. So, my question to you is, based on your experience of your living your own life, based on experience of talking and being in company with such wise people so for so many years, right? What do you think are the most dumb ways of living a life? So I'm
Huh.
just trying to get your view on the inversion technique that Charlie Munger talked about, right?
Yeah, I I think this whole approach of being selfish and fueling your own ego, um, we know kind of leads to a dead end, right? If you look at the lives of people, this is a very Mungerian approach, right? He collects examples of disastrous outcomes and then asks why did it happen. So if you look at the lives of people you know in your own family or your um, circle of friends or your parents' friends or the like, and you see lives that didn't work out, um, then you start to ask yourself, what went wrong? Why didn't it work wrong? Why didn't it work out? It's frequently, I think, because of a failure of deferred gratification, right? It's a desire for instant gratification. So um, they took a shortcut. So maybe it was um, really fun to sleep with the next door neighbor while the spouse was away, or uh, it was easier to cheat on your taxes or to uh, lie to your boss and then you got found out, or um, again, it's really hard to say these things without sounding moralistic or sanctimonious about it. So I like the idea that um, what people like Munger are doing is they're just saying, does it work? And so you don't need to be that moralistic about it. You can just say, well, how did that work for you? Being angry and telling the person, we've all done this a million times, right? Where you decide you're not going to say that thing to your boss or your girlfriend or your partner or whatever, and then you say it. And so it's these moments where you give in to what's pretty obviously uh, not going to work out well, that I think tend to land us in trouble. But I think because we're all so deeply flawed, we're all tripping up constantly. So I took heart from Tom Gayner's idea that what you want is to be directionally correct. You're not trying to be perfect, because if you have if you have incredibly high standards for yourself and you're kind of unforgiving, you're going to be screwing up so much the whole time that you're just full of self-loathing and shame and guilt. And um, one of the things I learned from studying David Hawkins that really fascinated me, if you read things like Power versus Force and his other books, Hawkins says that emotions like feelings like shame and guilt calibrate very low. They're kind of negative. And so I kind of came to the conclusion that what you want to do is flood the zone with more positive emotions like love, compassion, mercy, kindness, things like that. That those will calibrate really high. And so instead of fixating on what not to do and beating yourself up the whole time for all of the things you failed to do, I think you also need to kind of encourage yourself when you do something good. Give yourself a little credit, which is very, very hard for me. I come much more from a sort of naturally self-flagellating position where I'm like, I can't believe I did that, and I'm such a schmuck, and I did this, and here are all the ways in which I failed. But Nick Sleep said to me at the end of that chapter about him and Zach, which is really about deferred gratification in many ways. He said that when you go against the conventional approach, you need to give yourself credit. You need to kind of encourage yourself and to be your own fan club in some sense, I guess. And so yeah, it's tilting the balance constantly towards these virtues like compassion, kindness, truthfulness, love, mercy. But when you screw up, when you mess up, I think again and again saying, let go with self-compassion and begin again. That's what I try to do, because I think otherwise I would become too despondent.
So you recently tweeted a quote from Leo Tolstoy where he said that a man is like a fraction whose numerator is what he is and whose denominator is what he thinks of himself. The larger the denominator, the smaller the fraction. This is such a beautiful thought, but how do you explain this to, say, your children? So that's one question. The second question is, what are the most important lessons in living a good life that you have shared with your children?
Yeah, it's funny. Also, because I'm so mathematically incompetent, the moment I hear things about denominators and numerators and the like, there's a little trigger inside my brain that starts to panic, and I'm like, what if I don't even understand this? Anyway, but yeah, the difference between what you actually are and what you think of yourself. That's a very important distinction. I talked before about trying to close the gap between what I say and what I actually am and the way I behave, because there really is a big gap. And these things I'm talking about are kind of more aspirational. This is how I want to be rather than how I am. And but I mean, Monish said to me the other day when I interviewed him on my podcast, he was talking about the humility of Warren and Charlie, that when he keeps saying to Charlie, Costco wouldn't be nearly as successful without you, and Berkshire basically wouldn't exist without you. Munger's just totally dismissive. He doesn't want to talk about his own contribution. That's kind of lovely that there's a gap in some ways between Munger's estimation of himself and the world's estimation of Munger. Like he's not overstating his wondrousness and falling into the trap of self-congratulation. And so that's a good path, right? So that's a reminder to me that I should probably talk less about trying to be a good person, and I should actually just try to be a good person. But we are in this position where we get to talk about these ideas and try to discuss this stuff and kind of work through it and figure out what works and doesn't work and why. So I think it's okay to talk about this stuff, but I don't want to fall into the trap of deluding myself into thinking that I am what I'm not. And so that's why that Tolstoy quote is very valuable to me. And then in terms of what I've tried to pass on to my kids, I drone on ad nauseam about these subjects, and I think they tend to tune out pretty quickly. But I think one thing very early on that we did, I mean, they're both very bright and very thoughtful, and they went to really good schools and the like, and I really cared about that. You know, I wanted them to have a great education and the like, and I wanted them to be smart, and and I fell into that trap of thinking, that their intelligence and accomplishments somehow reflected well on me. But at the same time, I did have some perspective on this stuff. And so even though I cared about their intellectual accomplishments and the like, one thing that my wife, who's called Lauren, who's lovely, and much wiser than me and talks much less about these issues, but actually is this way, she actually is what I aspire to be. One thing we would say to the kids over and over again is we're not going to judge you by how well you do at school. and how successful you are. We would say there's a lot to our son, who's Henry, who's older than our daughter Madeline. We would say, we'll judge you by how kind you are. We'll judge you by how kind you are to your sister in particular. And I think of all the things we did as parents, no doubt we screwed up lots of things, but I think that was hugely valuable to say, we'll judge you by how kind you are. I'm really glad we did that, because I see, I think they're naturally very kind people, but I see the way that Henry would treat Madeline, and they definitely had their moments where they would fight and they would bicker and they would treat each other badly. But I think there's a fundamental kindness to the relationship that's really lovely. And I see that also. I really tried to convey this in the chapter about Nick and Zach, that Nick said it's a relationship built on kindness. And one thing that struck me is that years after they had closed down their Nomad partnership, excuse me, years after closing down the partnership, they still shared an office. And they didn't go into it very often, but they have this beautiful sunlit office on the King's Road in Chelsea and London, where, Zach still has his lazy boy chair and no desk, and they have lots of books, and they're happy to be there. And when I interviewed them there together, they're completing each other's sentences. There's deep friendship there. And that's not an accident. When they were deciding how to share their business, how to divide it, Nick was kind of the alpha dog. Nick had already been very successful. Zach had been an institutional broker at Deutsche Bank, which he hated. And Nick kind of brings him in and says, we're just going to split the business 50-50. We're equal partners. And Zach says, no, I want you to have 51% of the business and I'll have 49% of the business. And then if there's ever a conflict, you'll make the decision about what we should do. And Nick said to me, when someone hands you a loaded gun like that and says, here, shoot me if you want, how can you do anything but behave decently? And so their relationship is built on kindness. And I just increasingly think that kindness is probably the master principle, that however complicated we want to get about all of this other stuff, about what works in life, and what doesn't work, I tie myself up in knots because I read all of these things. I'm constantly learning new truths, new lessons, relearning lessons I'd already learned, getting all overexcited about some new thing that I learned. And actually, at some level, it's incredibly simple. It all comes down to kindness. And so my kind of North Star, because I'm very confused a lot of the time, and I tie myself up in knots by studying too much and talking too much, I try to come back again and again to things like this line from I think it's from Power versus Force, where Hawkins says, simple kindness to oneself and all that lives is the most transformational force of all. And so I just keep saying, okay, so I screwed up in this way, I'm flawed in this way, I failed in this way, I succeeded in this way went good, fine, let me just try to be kinder. And I sort of think having that as your North Star, coming back to that again and again, is incredibly clarifying, because it guides you in any conversation. And when you're thinking of saying something mean, or you say something insensitive, and then you're like, should I apologize or not? But also, I think what's really interesting about that line from Hawkins is he says, simple kindness to oneself and all that lives is the most transformational force of all. And that was a very hard thing for me to listen to and to put into practice. And so I think, having grown up in England and gone through that very intense schooling, that sort of real outer scorecard schooling system, one way that I got ahead in my early years was by being unkind to myself, by constantly pushing myself harder and saying, I'll show those bastards, I'm gonna like, this person rejected me, this person killed a story of mine, this person didn't appreciate how smart I was, I'll show them. And so it was all, none of it was really built on kindness. It was much more built on uh, ego, this overwhelming desire to prove that I was lovable, admirable, smart, impressive. And I think in retrospect, I mean, I remember still with some degree of shame having a dinner with a couple of friend of mine who was at Oxford with me at the time, and taking the piss out of him constantly. And I realized afterwards, I was sort of embarrassed. I was funny taking the piss out of him. And then I realized afterwards, it was really unkind. And he took it really well. He's a really lovely guy, but it was unkind. And it made me feel better and sort of superior and stronger to be witty and fast and all. But it was just kind of unkind, and it leaves you feeling depleted and a little ashamed. And so in retrospect, I think what I wish I'd figured out earlier was that there was this better strategy of trying to become kinder and more loving and more decent and more compassionate and more truthful. And so I found a post-it that I have all of these post-its on my wall. And so I'll leave you with this thing, because as Guy often says to me, he if something's embarrassing to him, then probably it's a good thing for him to reveal. And so I found this thing, and I'm kind of embarrassed about it. I found it in my desk the other day. And so I put it on my I put it on my wall, and it's in a place where most people won't see it. So I'm clearly sort of embarrassed by it because it sounds sort of too pious. But it says on here, I vow to become kinder, more loving, more compassionate, more forgiving, more truthful, and more sharing. I'm like, I looked at that and I was like, I have no recollection of writing that, but I'm like, yeah, that's pretty good. And so that's me having figured out over the years, there's a better way to be. And actually, all of those things, I was looking at that and I'm like, does anything not ring true? Like, can I not do any of those things? And I'm like, no, actually, I can become kinder. I can become more compassionate, more forgiving, more truthful, and more sharing. All of those things are actually within the realm of the possible. And I'm not sure I can become smarter. I'm not sure I can become wiser. I'm not sure I can lose the 30 pounds that I'd really like to lose. I'm not sure I'm ever going to become really fit. It looks like I'm not going to be able to save my hair, which continues to thin. There are all of these ways in which I'm going to continue to probably deteriorate. But these things are within my capability. And that's kind of cool. And so that's totally different from the goals that I would have had many years ago, where it would have been, I'm going to become richer, more famous, more powerful, more successful. I mean, it's funny, none of those things came. Yeah. I mean, it's interesting. It's interesting that in a moment of truth, that's what I wrote. Not there wasn't some financial target or something. So that's what I'm trying to shift towards. But it's not an easy process, and it's full of self-deception, and I'm embarrassed to talk about it because I'm aware of the gap between the reality and the words. But at least now I know that that's the direction I ought to be pushing in.
Yeah, I think kindness, like you mentioned, is such a powerful concept, and I too learned it late in life, right? But whenever I'm on the brink of being unkind, right? I go back to that statement, I think, from Carl Sagan, who coined this term called the pale blue dot, right? The earth on which we live, and he says that help is not going to come from outside, right? And it's our responsibility to be kind to each other on this small insignificant dot that we all lived in, hanging in the universe, right? So I think it's one of the most powerful concepts, like you mentioned. Great.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think what's striking is the truth is not complicated. And so, as with all of these things, it's because we're intelligent people who are kind of sophisticated and we have nuanced minds and we're always looking for new truths. our eyes kind of glaze over when we hear stuff that sounds too simple and platitudinous. And I think, as with so many things, Munger got this right when he talked about investing and said it's simple, not easy. And so, with all of these things, becoming more forgiving, becoming more self compassionate, becoming more loving, becoming kinder, simple, not easy. But knowing that this is what's going to lead to good relationships and to self respect and to fulfillment and to happiness and to a sense of real abundance is the first. It's like Munger said to you in answer to your question, like just the fact that you're asking the question means you're halfway there. The fact that we know that it's not the money, the fame, the power, the number of likes on Twitter or shares or whatever, or followers on LinkedIn, we know that that's not going to do it, that's the hedonic treadmill. That's the first half of the realization. And so in that chapter about Monish, I think one of my conclusions was when he said, when he was influenced by Munger saying, take a simple idea and take it seriously. That's an incredibly powerful insight, that when you find a simple idea, like compounding goodwill, becoming kinder, becoming more loving, being self-compassionate, not falling into shame and guilt, but actually trying to become better and flood the zone with these more powerful emotions that are more beneficial. When you find something like that resonates, one of these great truths, I think you want to make it a real core of how you behave and live. And it's the repetition, it's the consistency, it's taking something like that idea of Gansula Tova, and this too is for the best, saying this, there is only light, it's nothing but light. And pounding that idea into your brain. If that resonates, maybe that's not that. Some people will listen to that and be like, no, it just doesn't ring true to me. But I can at least try to be kinder. Fine. There's not like one path up the mountain. But when you find something that really resonates, go big on it. Like really go big on it. Like if you find a master principle that works, you want to make it part of the core of how you live.
William, just two more questions, one small and another one probably you can take some time to reflect and just answer that. So my second last question is about your recommendation for books, right? You read a lot, yeah, across subjects, right? But if you were to name your like most life-changing books, right, you've ever read, right, which ones would those be?
There are three areas that I've been studying a lot in recent years. The most important for me is studying the Kabbalists, and so this is an ancient form of Jewish mysticism, and so there are authors that I've found incredibly helpful within that. But there's a particular lineage. So there's a teacher I have called Michael Berg. His father was called Rav Philip Berg. His teacher was called Rav Yehuda Brandwein, and his teacher was called Rav Yehuda Ashlag. And any book by that lineage I found incredibly powerful. There was one of the first and strangest books that I read from any of them that I haven't read in many years was from Rav Berg. Rav means teacher. And it was called Wheels of a Soul. And it was about reincarnation, which is not something that Jews often talk about, but the Kabbalists talked about it. And obviously it's very important in other faiths. And I remember going to visit my son when he was at boarding school in France for a semester, walking around a lake and thinking about that book and thinking, if this is true, then everything I believe is wrong. And that was a start of opening my eyes to other ways of thinking and to thinking, oh, there's some deep order here that goes beyond randomness and chaos. So that was a gateway drug for me, that book, Wheels of a Soul. And I think it's really interesting that an idea like that goes through Hinduism, which obviously you know infinitely more about than I do, Tibetan Buddhism, Kabbalah. When an idea like reincarnation goes through different faiths, that makes me think probably true. And I see the same thing in David Hawkins. He talks a lot about that idea of reincarnation. So these are things that in the past I would have been kind of curious about, but a little dismissive about, or dismissive of. Now I'm inclined to think, yeah, there's this whole level of reality that we're not really seeing and that you can't explain, but that we sense is true. Where you meet someone and you have a powerful connection with them, or and there are ways of explaining all of these things, I guess, but there are things that I don't think you can rationally explain that I believe are true. But really the most important book for me is this thing, which is on my desk, which is always on my desk, pretty much, which is the Zohar, which is the most important Kabbalistic text, and it's according to the Kabbalists, is 2,000 years old, and was written by a student of Rabbi Akiva. There's often debate about who actually wrote it, but the Kabbalists will say there's no debate. We know who wrote it, and they don't even really say wrote it. It's like it was revealed by Shimon Bar Yochai, who was the main student of Rabbi Akiva, who hid in a cave with his son Rav Elazar for something like 11 years, and then they were in hiding because the Romans had killed Rabbi Akiva in a very brutal way. You were not really allowed to sort of share these secrets of the universe, and so they killed Rabbi Akiva. Shimon Bar Yochai flees to the north of Israel, hides in this cave, and I've been to the cave, and in fact, I've been fiddling with this during our interview. This fell off the ceiling of the cave in which the Zohar was revealed and fell on my mother's head, and so I fiddle with this constantly, and so that's a very mysterious book that's written in Aramaic, but you translate, and so I tend most days to open it kind of randomly. And just find something. And so this morning I opened it randomly before we talked, and you look at it and there's some, I'll tell you this. So I this is where I had opened it, and there's a sentence that's so beautiful that I wrote it to myself. So it says, this is the translation. So Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, Shimon, son of Yochai, bent over and kissed the dust. He said, "Word, word, I have chased you since the day I became a man, and now this matter is revealed to me from the source and essence of everything." And so he's revealing this secret, but he does it in such a beautiful way where literally he bends over and kisses the dust and says, "Word, word, I have chased you since the day I became a man, and now it's been revealed to me." And so it's sort of revealing these secrets again and again about what's concealed in the Old Testament. And it's written in an incredibly enigmatic way. So you rarely understand it, or at least I rarely understand it. But you sense that there's this deep truth there, and that it's kind of, it's explaining everything. And there's a sense in which it's also a source of energy, rather than energy and protection and blessings, rather than just being a physical book, that it's actually a kind of force to have in your life. And so all of the teachings of the Kabbalists basically come from that text. And so I have great respect for these books that have stood the test of time. So someone was talking to me the other day about the Upanishads, which I have, but don't understand much of. And, another friend was talking to me about Lao Tzu and, that great tradition. I also have great respect for that stuff that survived forever. Also, I've spent a lot of time studying Tibetan Buddhism recently, and there's a particular lineage there that I like very much. There's a teacher called Tsoknyi, Tsoknyi Rinpoche. Rinpoche means precious one, and his brother Mingyur Rinpoche, and their father Tulku Urgyen Rinpoche. That's an incredible lineage. And so I've been reading a lot of their books recently. And again, it's it's these spiritual traditions that have stood the test of time. So likewise with the Stoics, the fact that those books by people like Marcus Aurelius, like his Meditations, or Seneca's Letters, or Epictetus, his discourses, things like that, they've stood the test of time. And so I think on the whole, the books that have had the biggest effect on me are the ones that have endured, that they're old. So I set up a book group a couple of years ago, and we just read classic fiction. We just read great fiction. We had this kind of comic discussion of whether we're only allowed to read dead authors, or whether they're authors who are pretty dead or almost dead, but great. And so we decided that basically it's dead authors who've stood the test of time, but with the possibility of a special waiver once in a while for someone who's great but almost dead. And so going for what's stood the test of time. So I'm reading a wonderful novel at the moment by a guy called Vasily Grossman called Life and Fate. And then, the novel we read before that was Crime and Punishment by Dostoevsky. We read Sentimental Education by Flaubert. Moby Dick we read. Pale Fire by Nabokov. And so Emma by Jane Austen. So there's an emphasis on great literature that stood the test of time. So I think the more you can read stuff that's great, that's not ephemeral, the better. So much as I love reading contemporary stuff, I tend to shift towards the old. So it's not an accident that the book that I have on my desk at all times is a 2,000-year-old book.
That's valuable. I think reading the super text or reading the enduring stuff, I think, is such an important idea, right? In a world where there's too much ephemeral stuff out there, too much noise, too much information that people are overloaded with. So I completely agree with.
And even if you don't understand it, in a way, it's like hanging out with the eminent dead, as Munger puts it. You're connecting yourself to the soul of Shimon Bar Yochai. So in that moment where he sees that there's a truth that's essential, that's come from this deeper place that truth comes from, and he bends down and he kisses the ground. There's a sense of awe at truths that lie beyond us that we don't really understand. There's a source of truth, that it's not all random and chaotic. And there are moments in the Zohar, there are these very beautiful things. So Zohar means splendor, I think, in Aramaic. So it's like the book of splendor. There are these moments where someone will reveal a truth. And there's this group of 10 friends who are together in this cave where they're revealing the Zohar. And one of them will say, if I had lived my whole life just to learn this one truth, it would have been enough. That's very beautiful. So the sense that there are deep truths underlying this world of illusion. I think that's interesting that in the Buddhist path and in the Kabbalistic path and in other paths, there's a sense that we live in a world of illusion. And so even though there's chaos and mayhem, and you feel you can get pulled down by it, and you can feel it's all hopeless or whatever, or you can get discouraged, you want to live in two realities simultaneously. So we're in this playground where we can make a difference with our own behavior, but at the same time, you're placing part of your consciousness in this realm beyond, where there's stuff we don't really understand, that we can't explain logically, that is beyond the rational, and yet it's very true. And so that requires almost a dismantling of the rational mind at the same time as we celebrate the rational mind. And so one of the things that F. Scott Fitzgerald talked about famously is he talked about how one sign of intelligence is to be able to hold two contradictory ideas in the mind at the same time, basically without going nuts. And so somehow we want to become more rational, more like Warren and Charlie, more like Howard Marks, and yet at the same time to be so irrational that you connect to this deeper truth that's concealed. And you don't want to fall into the intellectual arrogance that I fell into earlier in my life, and that I think a lot of it's very tempting for people who are very reductionist to start to believe, well, science shows this. It's like that just becomes a religion in its own right. It becomes a form of closed-mindedness, and so that sense of openness and of not really knowing and of having humility and knowing that there's something. Maybe that's partly what's so helpful about the Zohar, is the fact that it's in Aramaic, the fact that even the translation I don't really understand, the fact that even when I see Shimon Bar Yochai talking about the secret that's been revealed to him, that's so wonderful that he kisses the dust and says, this is what I've been chasing since I was made a man, since I was born. The fact that I don't understand it gives me a kind of humility to say, God, there's so much that I don't know and that I don't understand. And so it may be that element of keeping your mind open is actually more valuable than me just understanding the secret, much as I would like to understand the secret.
I think that lesson on humility is worth noting here. So there's so much we don't know, right? And as someone said, the more we know, the more we realize that we don't know so many things in life. So
Yeah.
that's a valuable idea. So thanks for that, William. William, just one last question, and then I'll let you go. Right? I know you asked this question to Charlie Munger after a daily journal meeting, and I want to ask you the same question today. Based on your own life experiences and also of studying so many successful and wise people over the years, what, according to you, makes for a happy life or a life well lived?
I've thought a lot about something that this teacher of mine, Rav Berg, said over and over again, which is, he said, every day you should be asking, what's the purpose of my soul? Like, what was I put here to achieve? And I think we each have our own path that's very, very different. It's not, maybe for Charlie is absolutely right not to read fiction and just to be devouring hundreds of nonfiction books a year, biographies and the like. But then I spoke to Rolf Dobelli the other day, who wrote the book The Art of Thinking Clearly, and one of the things that Rolf believes is that he should just read a handful of books a year and read them multiple times and really understand them, and that any book that's really worth reading you should read twice. Two totally different approaches, and both of them are right and both of them are true, and yet they're contradictory. And for me to read fiction, or for Guy's read War and Peace and Stendhal, and he's been reading, long old nonfiction books like Thucydides' History of the Peloponnesian War. That for him constitutes a rich life. And so I think you have to start with the awareness that the purpose of your life is different than the purpose of someone else's life, and that what makes it special and unique and valuable is different to you than to someone else. And to have that question on your mind every day, which I frequently forget to ask, but to be asking constantly, please reveal to me the purpose of my soul. What am I here to do? What's my particular piece of the puzzle that I'm supposed to complete? Is a very helpful thing, because there's a sense also that it's revealed gradually, that we don't really know. And so you also want to be open-minded enough, even about your own life, that you're willing to be shown, that you're not so convinced this is right for me, this is wrong for me, that you close off options. You want to be listening and say, yeah, what if I'm not supposed to write another book? Or what if really I'm only supposed to write books? Or what if, and I don't know, most of the big decisions I've made about things like moving to New York, that was an irrational decision, where I moved to New York from London because my brother was dating an American woman and thought he was going to live in New York. and they bought an apartment at the top of the property bubble in the late 1980s. And I didn't want my brother to get rich without me. So I bought a stake in the apartment too. And then the bubble burst and we couldn't rent the apartment out. And I ended up moving and living with his girlfriend in the apartment. And that's how I came to America. And then I met my wife here and I had my kids here. And then we moved to Hong Kong in a kind of irrational way where I became the deputy editor and then the editor of the Asian edition of Time, having never even been in Asia before. And then we moved to London after I decided I would never move back to London. And then we moved back to New York. None of it's really been logical. And yet it's been kind of beautiful and has turned, has led to really beautiful things. And it's all been irrational or marginally rational. And so I think having this sense that you're kind of being led or being drawn in some kind of magnetic way towards something kind of beautiful, that there's some deep pattern that you want to align yourself with. Again, this would have seemed utterly irrational and stupid and kind of puerile to me many years ago. But I increasingly think it's true that it's almost, Hawkins writes about this, right? It's like there are these attractor fields, he'll say, that different levels of consciousness that draw you into a certain orbit. And so you can see it with someone like Monish, that as Monish became increasingly truthful and honest and honorable and more selfless, he gets drawn more and more tightly into Charlie's orbit. And so consciousness is what's determining their reality. So I think in some way I'm aware this is a sort of slightly rambling and illogical answer, but in some way, I have this sense that there's this kind of underlying plan where you're being kind of drawn in a particular direction that allows you to work on your consciousness and elevate your consciousness. And as that's happening, you're being drawn in a particular direction. And so the whole game for me is to work on my consciousness and try to elevate my consciousness in some way, despite all of my flaws and foibles and failings. Because as that happens, I think I'm kind of drawn to better people, better opportunities, all of that stuff. But that makes it sound kind of just physical, just external. Actually, I think what's going on is much more internal. So if I'm really honest about it, what Rav Ashlag says is that the purpose of your life is to cleave to your creator. And so you're becoming closer and closer to your creator, to this force of love, mercy, kindness, compassion, truth, sharing. And the way that you do that is through what he calls an affinity of forms. And so like attracts like. So the more that your form is like the form of your creator, the closer you become to it. And so the more loving and the kinder and the more compassionate you become, the more that gap between you and your creator disappears. And I would have really wrestled with the term creator, and I'm not in any way trying to be proselytizing. I'm just trying to be honest about what I think. But so I feel like that's the real secret to an abundant life is somehow to become closer and closer to your creator, but not in a proselytizing sort of man with a beard in the sky kind of way. It's to become more loving, kinder, and more compassionate, and less fearful, less anxious, less obsessed with what people say about you, less obsessed with external stuff like your money and your fame and your reputation. And so it's more the quality of your character. And so when I look at this is why I ended the book by writing about Arnold, is I look at Arnold and I see someone who's undergone this extraordinary transformation, where I think he went from being someone who was full of rage and sadness and depression and has become this incredibly loving, kind, decent, sharing person. And partly what happened to him is that he worked tremendously on his own consciousness. Partly what happened is he got incredibly lucky that he married a really lovely woman who he's been with for 50 years, who's incredibly loving and who's helped to transform him. And so I think partly it's through our own efforts that we transform, and partly it's a pure gift. It's you know I I don't think Jews really talk about grace, but I love that term that Christians often use about grace. That there's just this unearned blessing where you're sometimes given things um, that help you become better. That a book comes into your life, a person comes into your life, a teaching, and it kind of lifts you up, even though you don't deserve it in any way. And it's I often think it sounds maybe kind of ridiculous, but I often feel like I met my wife when I was like 22, um, uh, and I sort of feel like I was gifted this thing that I totally didn't deserve, and it's almost like the Kabbalists sometimes talk about borrowing from your perfected soul. It's like there's a perfect version of you somewhere. It's like a Platonic idea, right? There are these perfect forms somewhere in the upper world, but you're still here, with your own crappy self behaving badly, and so you're borrowing from your perfected soul. So it's almost like I got this. I got in meeting my wife. I got this gift that I totally didn't deserve, but maybe one day I'll deserve the thing that I've already been given, and so you're yeah so in a way you want to appreciate the fact that you're I want to appreciate more the fact that I'm being gifted these things that I don't really deserve, and that I'm being drawn in this direction um that's very beautiful, and even though I keep stumbling and keep doing stupid stuff to fall off the path and sabotaging myself along the way, I hope that the forces that bring you to that desirable destination are so powerful that they overcome my own stupidity and capacity to sabotage myself.
That's a great lesson, William. So thank you so much for the gift of your time. And I think 3 hours later, more than 3 hours later, I'm certainly richer, wiser, and happier,
Ha.
as your
Thank you.
wonderful book suggests, right? And I thank you so much. I'd like uh, uh, for writing this book, for creating this book, right? And for the kind of person that you are, right? You've
Or hope to be.
spoken. We're all on this journey, right? So I think that's
Yeah.
the most important thing. But I thank you from the bottom of my heart for being there,
Thank you.
right? Talking to me and sharing your insights.
Thank
Thank
you.
you
And
so
thank you
much,
for
William.
asking such wonderful questions. Very, very thoughtful questions. And it's great. You forced me to think, which is uh, it's hard. So yeah, I've tried to be honest, which is difficult, because I feel a little sheepish about some of the things that I've shared here. But I hope if someone listens and finds it helpful, then that's great. So thank you for giving me the opportunity to bloviate for 3 hours.
Thank you so much, William. And I look forward to connect with you very soon. Thank
I
you.
look forward to it anytime. Take care.
Great.